He pulled his hat lower and pressed on, following a trail only he could see. The sudden sound of splintering wood and panicked horses cut through the howl of the wind. Elias froze, listening. The sound came again, the unmistakable crack of an axle braking, followed by the high-pitched scream of a woman. He moved toward the sound, each step deliberate in the deepening snow. As he crested a ridge overlooking the pass, he saw it, an overturned wagon half buried in a snowdrift, one wheel spinning uselessly in the air. A team of horses struggled against their harnesses, their breath forming desperate clouds in the frigid air. Near the wagon, a woman in a tattered coat was on her knees in the snow, her arms wrapped protectively around a small child. Three other children huddled behind her, their faces pale with cold and fear. Elias approached silently, his rifle held loose but ready at his side. In these mountains, tragedy often drew predators of both the animal and human variety. Elias felt something shift inside him, a door long closed creaking open. He slowly lowered his rifle and knelt in the snow, bringing himself eye level with the child. He shook his head once, definitively. The woman's face betrayed both relief and suspicion. A thin trickle of blood ran from a gash at her temple, freezing in the bitter cold. "The storm is worsening," she said, struggling to her feet. "We need to find shelter." Elias nodded, then pointed up the ridge toward the stand of pines where his cabin stood. He held out his hands in a gesture that asked permission to help. "You live nearby?" When he nodded again, understanding dawned in her eyes. "You don't speak?" Elias touched his throat, then shook his head. "Are you offering us shelter?" When he nodded, she exhaled shakily. "Thank God, the children won't survive the night in this cold." Elias approached the wagon and quickly assessed what could be salvaged. Elias simply nodded again and turned his attention to the practical matters of survival. He hung the children's wet clothes near the fire, then set a pot of snow to melt for water. From a cupboard, he produced dried meat, beans, and hard biscuits. Simple fare, but nourishing. As he prepared a meal, Clara took stock of her surroundings. The cabin held few personal belongings, but those present told a story. A faded daguerreotype in a simple wooden frame showed a woman holding a small boy. Medical books lined a small shelf. A battered doctor's bag sat in a corner, its leather cracked with age and use. Above the fireplace hung a cavalry saber and an old Union Army officer's hat. "You were a soldier," Clara observed. "And a doctor?" Elias paused in his work and nodded once, then returned to his task. As the cabin warmed and the smell of cooking food filled the air, the children began to relax. Young Annie explored the single room with curious eyes while Maggie helped set out the tin plates Elias provided. The boys remained watchful, especially Thomas, who stayed close to his mother's side. When the meal was ready, Elias served his guests first, then took a modest portion for himself. They ate in silence, broken only by the howl of the wind and the crackling fire. After the meal, Elias examined Clara's head wound with clinical detachment. His large, calloused hands moved with surprising gentleness as he cleaned the gash and applied a salve from his medical supplies. His touch was that of a trained physician, at odds with his rough exterior. Clara watched his face as he worked. How does a doctor end up alone in these mountains? Elias's hands stilled for a moment. He finished dressing her wound, then returned to his slate. "War," he wrote simply. Clara seemed to understand that some questions should remain unasked. The storm raged outside, but it was not the weather that kept him awake. It was the woman's wound, not from the wagon accident, but older bruises visible on her wrists when she rolled up her sleeves. It was the fear in the children's eyes, too pronounced to be explained by a simple mishap in the snow. It was the way they had been traveling light and fast, in weather no sensible person would choose for a journey. They were running from something, or someone. Elias knew about running. He had been doing it for 7 years. Morning brought no respite from the storm. The snow continued to fall, piling high against the cabin walls. Elias rose before dawn and rekindled the fire without waking his guests. He was setting coffee to boil when Clara stirred. She sat up, momentarily disoriented, then relaxed when she remembered where they were. The children slept on, exhausted from their ordeal. Clara joined Elias by the fire, accepting a cup of strong black coffee with grateful hands. "You're up early," she observed quietly. Elias shrugged and pointed to his eyes, then mimicked a scanning motion. "Keeping watch." You were guarding us all night? When he nodded, she studied him more carefully. Most men would consider us a burden. Why help us? Elias hesitated, then reached for his slate. Could not leave children in snow. Clara's eyes softened. No, I suppose a doctor couldn't. They sat in companionable silence as dawn gradually lightened the cabin. The boy struggled but persevered without complaint. My father taught me to never show weakness, Thomas said, his breath forming clouds. Before he died. Elias glanced at the boy, noting the pride and pain mingled in his voice. Mama says you were in the war. My father wasn't. He was an engineer, designed mines and railroads. He said building things was better than destroying them. They trudged on in silence for a time. Did you kill many men in the war? Elias stopped and turned to face the boy. After a moment's consideration, he nodded once, his eyes grave. I thought so. Thomas looked away. Men are trying to kill us too. That's why we're running. Elias's brow furrowed. He gestured for the boy to continue. My father worked for the Silverstone Mine Company. He found out they were mining illegally on Ute land and bribing government officials. He was going to report them, but Thomas's voice broke. They said it was an accident, a cave-in, but it wasn't. And Elias placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. Mr. Maxwell, he owns the mine. He came to our house after the funeral, said we needed to leave, that the company house was for employees. But that wasn't the real reason. Thomas kicked at the snow. He was looking for my father's notebook, the one with all the evidence. They reached the wagon, now almost completely buried. Together they dug through the snow to access the remaining belongings. It's in Annie's doll, Thomas confided as he rummaged through a trunk. Father gave it to her the night before he died. Told her it was a special secret, that Lucy had something important inside her. Maxwell doesn't know that. He pulled out a homemade cloth doll with yarn hair and button eyes. This is why they're after us. Mama thinks if we can get to Denver, to the federal marshal's office, we'll be safe. Elias processed this information with a soldier's assessment of threat and a doctor's concern for his patients. As they gathered what little they could carry and turned back toward the cabin, his mind was already calculating what would come next. The storm had blown itself out by the time they returned, leaving behind a crystalline blue sky and a world transformed by snow. In the new clarity, Elias could see for miles across the valley, including the thin column of smoke rising from a camp no more than 3 miles distant. Thomas saw it too. Is that another cabin? Elias shook his head, his expression grim. He hustled the boy back inside, then retrieved his spyglass from beside the window. Through it, he could make out 4 riders and pack horses, men equipped for a long hunt in difficult conditions, or a persistent pursuit. Clara read the concern in his face. They've found us, haven't they? Elias nodded, then wrote on his slate, How many follow you? Maxwell has several men who do his bidding. His foreman, Jackson, is the most dangerous. He was the one who, she gestured to her healing wound. There's also the company doctor, Warren. He signed my husband's death certificate without ever examining the body. Elias's hand tightened around the chalk at the mention of a doctor complicit in such deception. Annie clutched her doll to her chest, oblivious to the danger it represented. Lucy was scared in the snow. She's happy to be warm now. Clara knelt beside her daughter. Annie, sweetheart, remember how Papa said Lucy had something special inside her? I need you to let me see it now. The little girl's face crumpled. But Papa said it was a secret. I know, darling, but Mr. Boone needs to see it to help us. Reluctantly, Annie handed over her cherished doll. Clara found a hidden seam in the doll's back and carefully extracted a small leather-bound notebook. She handed it to Elias. This is what they want. My husband documented everything. The illegal mining operations, the bribes, the claims that rightfully belong to the Ute tribe. There's a map showing where they're extracting silver from Ute territory. John was going to take this to the Indian Agency and the federal marshal. Elias thumbed through the notebook, his expression darkening with each page. The meticulous notes and drawings showed not just corruption, but a callous disregard for both law and human life. Several pages documented unsafe mining practices that had led to deaths that could have been prevented. He returned the notebook and wrote, Need to move you. Not safe here. The pass to Denver will be blocked for weeks, Clara said. Where can we go? Elias considered their options. His isolated cabin had been his sanctuary, but it would become a trap if Maxwell's men found them. They needed somewhere defensible with allies if possible. Ute Village, he wrote. 3 days' journey. They will help. The Ute? Clara looked uncertain. Will they welcome us? Elias nodded and wrote, I heal their sick. They trust me. Then that's our best hope. Clara squared her shoulders. How soon can we leave? Tomorrow. Need supplies. Clara gathered her children close. We're going on another journey, little ones. Mijaboon is taking us somewhere safe. While Clara prepared the children, Elias inventoried his supplies, mentally calculating what they would need for the journey. He checked his weapons, the rifle, his army Colt revolver, and the hunting knife at his belt. If Maxwell's men were as dangerous as Clara suggested, they would need more than just speed and stealth. As dusk approached, Elias went out to check on the horses and gather more firewood. The crisp mountain air carried sounds for miles, and he paused often to listen. He was stacking wood by the cabin door when he heard it, the faint but unmistakable whinny of a horse from the direction of the camp he'd spotted earlier. Moving silently to higher ground, Elias observed through his spyglass as the 4 riders broke camp. They were heading directly toward the trail that led to his cabin. Inside, he found Clara teaching Maggie and Samuel a quiet, clapping game, while Thomas whittled a small piece of wood by the fire. Annie slept, her doll clutched tight against her chest. Clara looked up, instantly alert to the tension in Elias's posture. They're coming, aren't they? Elias nodded and quickly wrote on his slate. Hide. Take children to root cellar. He moved a bearskin rug aside, revealing a trapdoor set into the floor. His store of winter provisions, an emergency shelter should the cabin itself become compromised. What about you? Clara asked as she woke Annie. We'll lead them away. Meet back here at dawn. Clara hesitated, then nodded. Children, quickly and quietly now. Bring only what you can carry. As Clara ushered the children down into the cellar, Elias gathered what he would need. Ammunition, his medical kit, provisions for a night in the open. He added more wood to the fire, making it appear that someone remained inside, then slipped out the back window. Moving from shadow to shadow, he circled around behind his cabin until he had a clear view of the approaching riders. Through his spyglass, he studied each man, committing their faces to memory. The leader was a hard-faced man with a shock of gray-streaked black hair beneath his hat. Jackson, the foreman, he presumed. Behind him rode 2 rough-looking men, hired guns by their appearance and the way they carried their rifles. The 4th rider surprised him, an older gentleman in a city coat, his refined bearing at odds with the rugged wilderness in the company he kept. Elias felt his breath catch as recognition dawned. Dear Edmund Warren, not just any company doctor, but a man he knew. They had served together in the Army of the Potomac, treating the wounded and dying side by side through the bloodiest days of the Civil War. Warren had known him when he still had a voice, when he was Captain Elias Boone, surgeon with the 20th Maine Volunteers. Before Antietam, before the silence, memories crashed over him like artillery fire, the screams of wounded men, the copper tang of blood, the weight of responsibility as he decided who might be saved and who was beyond help. Warren had been there on that fateful day, had witnessed what broke him. Now his old comrade rode with men who had murdered Clara's husband and threatened her children. Elias slipped away into the trees, leading his horse quietly until he was far enough of a way to mount without being heard. Then he deliberately left tracks heading west, away from the cabin and the route they would take to the Ute village. He rode hard for a mile, making the trail obvious, then doubled back through a stream bed where his horse would leave no tracks. From a high ridge overlooking his cabin, he watched as Jackson and his men approached. They surrounded the cabin cautiously, guns drawn. Warren remained back, his discomfort evident even at this distance. Jackson pounded on the door, then kicked it open when no answer came. The men disappeared inside. Elias knew the root cellar's entrance was well hidden. If Clara and the children remained quiet, they might escape detection. Still, he kept his rifle ready, prepared to create a diversion if necessary. After several minutes, the men emerged from the cabin. Jackson gestured angrily at the tracks Elias had left, and they remounted, following the false trail westward. Elias waited until they were out of sight before making his way back to the cabin. He approached cautiously, alert for any sign that one of the men might have remained behind. The cabin door stood open, the interior in disarray. They had searched thoroughly, upending his meager furnishings and emptying cupboards. On the table lay his slate, and on it, a message in an educated hand. "Captain Boone, I know you're alive. We should talk before blood is shed. Warren." Elias stared at the message, a muscle twitching in his jaw. After 7 years of silence, his past had found him and brought danger to his door. He moved the rug and rapped twice on the trapdoor. Clara pushed it open, her face pale in the fading light. "Are they gone?" Elias nodded, helping her and the children up from their hiding place. "They took some of our food," Thomas reported, "and they looked at your things." Elias quickly wrote on his slate, "Must leave tonight. No time to wait." Clara surveyed the ransacked cabin with dismay. "I'm so sorry to have brought this trouble to you." Elias shook his head dismissively and began gathering essential supplies. There was no time for regret. Maxwell's men would soon realize they had been led astray and would return. By then, they needed to be well away from here, their tracks covered by the darkness. As he helped the children bundle up against the night cold, Elias found young Annie looking up at him with solemn eyes. "Are you going to fight the bad men?" she asked. Elias knelt to her level and met her gaze steadily. Fighting meant killing, and killing meant more ghosts to haunt his dreams. But when he looked into the trusting eyes of this child and thought of what men like Maxwell would do to protect their secrets, he knew his answer. He nodded once firmly. Annie reached up and patted his bearded cheek with a small hand. "Papa said sometimes good men have to fight so others can be safe." Elias felt something break and reform inside him, a resolve he had thought died in the blood-soaked fields of Maryland. He lifted Annie onto his shoulders and led the way outside to where the horses waited. Under the cold light of the stars, they rode away from the only home Elias had known for 7 years, heading deeper into the mountains where ancient pines stood sentinel against the sky. Behind them, the cabin sat dark and empty, a chapter closed. What Elias didn't see was the lone rider watching from a distant ridge, Dr. Warren, who had doubled back, separating from Jackson's group. The doctor lowered his spyglass, his expression troubled as he watched his former comrade lead the Hollander family into the wilderness. In his pocket was a folded paper, a wanted notice for Clara Hollander, charged with theft of company property and suspected murder of her husband. Charges he knew to be false, yet had helped craft to ensure her capture. Warren turned his horse back toward the main trail, his decision made. Captain Elias Boone had saved his life once, in another world. That debt remained unpaid. But greater forces were at work, forces that could destroy them all if Maxwell's plans came to light. As dawn broke over the mountains, two groups moved in opposite directions, one seeking justice, the other determined to bury the truth. And somewhere between them, in a notebook hidden inside a child's doll, lay enough evidence to bring down an empire built on corruption and blood. They traveled by moonlight, the silence broken only by the soft crunch of snow beneath hooves and the occasional whisper of wind through pine boughs. Elias led them along game trails and narrow passes where the snow lay shallow, careful to choose routes that would be difficult to follow. Behind him rode Clara with Annie held securely before her, then Thomas on his own mount, and finally Samuel and Maggie sharing the packhorse. Elias kept them moving through the bitter cold of night, stopping only when the children could no longer stay awake in their saddles. He found shelter in a small cave, its entrance partially concealed by fallen timber, and quickly built a smokeless fire using dry pine needles and deadwood. As the children huddled close to the flames, Clara approached Elias where he stood guard at the cave entrance. "Will we reach the Ute village tomorrow?" she asked, her breath clouding in the frigid air. Elias shook his head and held up 3 fingers. 3 days still?" She sighed, wrapping her threadbare coat tighter. "The children are exhausted, Mr. Boone." He nodded in understanding, then gestured toward the mountains with a sweeping motion of his arm. "We're taking a longer route to avoid pursuit," Clara interpreted. When he nodded, she asked, "Do you think they'll continue to follow us, even into Ute territory?" Elias's expression hardened. He wrote on his slate, "Maxwell desperate. Men like him don't stop." Clara's shoulders slumped. "Then we've brought danger to you and potentially to the Ute as well. I'm sorry." Elias shook his head and wrote again, "Your husband fought for justice. We honor his courage. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. John was a good man. He believed in doing what was right, even when it was difficult, even when it was dangerous. She pulled John's notebook from inside her coat. He knew what this might cost him, but he couldn't live with himself if he remained silent. The irony of her words was not lost on Elias. He had chosen silence as his refuge from the horrors he had witnessed. John Hollander had chosen to speak out against injustice, and it had cost him his life. You were a surgeon in the war, Clara said, studying his face in the dim firelight. Thomas told me what you wrote. What happened to make you leave that life behind? Elias stared out at the snow-covered landscape, his eyes distant. After a long moment, he wrote, "Some wounds never heal." Clara didn't press further. Instead, she placed a gentle hand on his arm. Thank you for helping us. Not many would risk themselves for strangers. Before dawn, they were moving again, climbing higher into the mountains. Elias set a grueling pace, pushing both humans and horses to their limits. By midday, they had reached a high ridge overlooking a vast expanse of wilderness. In the distance, plumes of smoke rose from what appeared to be a mining operation. Is that Silverstone? Thomas asked, riding up beside Elias. Elias nodded grimly. The boy stared at the source of their troubles with undisguised hatred. My father died down there. They said it was an accident, but it wasn't. Thomas's young face hardened with a determination beyond his years. I'm going to make them pay, someday. Elias placed a restraining hand on the boy's shoulder and shook his head. He pointed to the notebook Clara carried, then to his heart, then made a motion of scales balancing. Justice, not revenge, Clara translated, joining them at the overlook. That's what your father would want, Thomas. The boy looked unconvinced but fell silent as they continued their journey. By nightfall, they had descended into a sheltered valley where a frozen creek wound its way through stands of aspen. Elias chose their campsite carefully, selecting a position with clear sight lines and multiple escape routes. As they settled in for the night, he took Thomas aside and began to teach him the basics of standing watch. Why me? The boy asked. Elias wrote, Man of family now, must learn to protect. Thomas straightened at these words, pride mingling with sorrow in his young face. I'll do my best, sir. While Clara prepared a meager supper from their dwindling supplies, Elias surveyed their back trail through his spyglass. The mountains were bombed, and their pursuers could approach from any direction. His instincts told him they were being followed, but thus far, he had seen no concrete evidence. After the meal, as the children prepared for sleep, Clara unfolded John's notebook and spread it on a flat rock near the fire. I think you should know exactly what we're carrying, she said quietly. If anything happens to me, someone needs to get this information to the authorities. The notebook contained detailed maps of the Silverstone mining operation, including tunnels that extended well beyond the company's legal claim and into Ute territory. John had documented meetings between Maxwell and various government officials, including the territorial governor's assistant and a federal Indian agent named Harrington. Amounts were listed next to names, bribes paid to ensure the Ute would be pushed farther from their ancestral lands. Most damning were John's notes about unsafe conditions in the mine. He had repeatedly warned of potential cave-ins due to inadequate supports, but Maxwell had ordered him to falsify safety reports. The final entry, dated the day before John's death, was chilling in its prescience. Confronted M today about the North Shaft. Told him I wouldn't sign off on it. He suggested I reconsider for the sake of my family. Not a threat made lightly. Have copied all documentation and will take to Marshal Wilson in Denver next week. God help us if I'm wrong about this, but I cannot be silent any longer. Elias's jaw tightened as he read the last line. John Hollander had chosen to break his silence and paid with his life. The parallels to his own situation were unmistakable, though the circumstances differed greatly. John believed Marshal Wilson was one of the few honest officials left in the territory, Clara explained. That's why we were heading to Denver when our wagon broke down. Elias nodded thoughtfully, then wrote, Dangerous knowledge. Yes, Clara agreed, but necessary. The Ute have been systematically pushed from their lands for years. This is just the latest encroachment, and the miners, most don't even know they're working illegally or in unsafe conditions. They trust the company to follow the law. A sound from the darkness beyond their camp brought Elias instantly alert. He motioned for Clara to be silent and extinguished the fire. Within seconds, they were plunged into darkness, with only the faint moonlight reflecting off snow to guide them. Elias moved silently to where the children slept, waking Thomas with a hand over the boy's mouth to prevent any sound of surprise. He gestured for the boy to stay with his siblings while he investigated. With the stealth born of years hunting these mountains, Elias melted into the forest. He moved from shadow to shadow, his senses attuned to the smallest disturbance. The sound came again, a horse's soft nickering, quickly hushed by its rider. Elias positioned himself behind a massive pine and waited. Minutes passed in complete silence. Then, just when he was beginning to think he had imagined the sound, a figure emerged from the trees not 20 yards from their camp. Even in the dim light, Elias recognized Dr. Warren. The physician moved cautiously, lone and apparently unarmed, except for a small revolver at his belt. He paused at the edge of the clearing, surveying the now dark campsite. "Boone," he called softly. "I know you're out there. I've come alone." Elias remained motionless, his rifle trained on his former comrade. "I'm not here on Maxwell's orders," Warren continued. "Jackson and the others are half a day behind me. I rode ahead to warn you." Still, Elias made no move to reveal his position. Warren sighed, his breath visible in the cold night air. "For God's sake, Elias, I served with you at Antietam. You saved my life at Fredericksburg. I'm not here to harm the woman or her children." At the mention of Fredericksburg, Elias's resolve wavered. The memories of that terrible battle, of carrying Warren through artillery fire after the doctor had been wounded tending to fallen soldiers, were still vivid despite the passing years. Slowly, Elias emerged from the shadows, his rifle lowered but ready. Warren's face showed visible relief. "Still alive then. I'd heard rumors, but..." He studied Elias's face in the moonlight. "You look well, all things considered." Elias made no response beyond a curt nod. "Still not speaking, I see." Warren's tone held no mockery, only a sad understanding. "Not since that day at the field hospital." Elias gestured impatiently for Warren to state his business. "Maxwell has hired professional manhunters, the Blackwood brothers. They're tracking you now, along with Jackson and a few mine guards. They'll reach this valley by noon tomorrow." Warren glanced toward the camp where Clara and her children were hidden. "They have orders to retrieve the notebook at any cost. Maxwell doesn't care if the woman and children survive." Elias's expression darkened. "I've been a coward, Elias," Warren admitted. "I knew what Maxwell was doing at Silverstone. I signed death certificates without questions, took his money, became part of his machine." He ran a hand through his graying hair. "But murder of women and children, I can't have that on my conscience. Not after what we saw in the war." Elias studied his former comrade's face, searching for deception. Finding none, he gestured for Warren to follow him back to camp. Clara had roused the children and prepared them for quick flight if necessary. She stood protectively before them, a small pistol, previously hidden in her skirts, held steadily in her hand. "Dr. Warren," she said coldly, "have you come to finish what Maxwell started?" Warren removed his hat. "No, Mrs. Hollander, I've come to warn you, and perhaps to atone in some small way for my part in all this." "Your part?" Clara's voice shook with anger. "You signed my husband's death certificate without examining his body. You claimed it was an accident when he was murdered." "Yes," Warren admitted. "I did that, and worse. I have no defense to offer except that once you begin compromising yourself for men like Maxwell, it becomes increasingly difficult to find your way back." Elias moved to Clara's side and placed a restraining hand on her arm. He shook his head slightly, not in forgiveness of Warren, but in recognition that they needed whatever information the doctor could provide. "Why should we believe anything you say?" Clara demanded. "Because Elias and I share a history," Warren replied. "He knows I'm capable of deception, but not of this kind, not anymore." He turned to Elias. "Tell her, Captain. Tell her whether you believe me." Elias considered for a long moment, then nodded once decisively. Clara lowered her pistol reluctantly. "What do you propose we do? The Ute village is still 2 days away." "There's an old trapper's cabin about 5 miles northwest of here," Warren said. "It's well hidden and defensible. You could wait there while I go to the Ute village and bring help." Elias shook his head immediately and wrote on his slate, "Could be trap." "I understand your suspicion," Warren acknowledged. "What would you suggest?" After a moment of consideration, Elias wrote, You take Clara and children to cabin. I go to Ute Village. Splitting up is dangerous, Warren objected. So is trusting you completely, Claire retorted. She turned to Elias. I don't want to separate either. We should all stay together. Elias considered their options, then wrote, all go to cabin. I continue alone to village once you're secure. Warren nodded. That's sensible. But we should move now under cover of darkness. The Blackwoods are renowned trackers. They'll find your trail at first light. And they broke camp swiftly, leaving as little trace of their presence as possible. Warren led them through a series of narrow ravines, taking a route that would be difficult to follow. The children, despite their exhaustion, remained remarkably stoic, understanding the gravity of their situation. As dawn approached, they reached the trapper's cabin, a crude but solid structure built against a cliff face with a small stream nearby. It was clearly abandoned, with spider webs in the corners and a thick layer of dust covering the simple furnishings, but it was sturdy and well concealed by surrounding pines. This will serve, Warren said as they dismounted. The Blackwoods won't know about this place. It's not on any map. How do you know of it then? Claire asked suspiciously. I treated the old trapper who built it, French-Canadian named Levesque. He died of pneumonia last winter. No family, no one to claim his property. Warren began clearing debris from the small stone fireplace. We can risk a small fire. The chimney draws well, and the trees will disperse the smoke. While Warren and Clara settled the children inside, Elias secured the horses in a natural enclosure formed by a horseshoe of rock walls behind the cabin. As he worked, he kept a watchful eye on his surroundings, alert for any sign of pursuit. When he returned to the cabin, he found Warren examining the wound on Clara's temple. This was no accident, the doctor observed. Someone struck you deliberately. Jackson, Clara confirmed, when he came to evict us from the company house. I refused to leave without John's personal effects. Her hand moved unconsciously to touch the healing gash. He said I should be grateful he wasn't doing worse. Warren's expression was troubled. Jackson was a guard at Andersonville during the war. He developed a taste for cruelty there. This new information solidified Elias's resolve. He had seen the aftermath of Andersonville prison, Union soldiers reduced to walking skeletons, broken in body and spirit by deliberate mistreatment. A man who had served as a guard in that hell on earth and enjoyed it was capable of unspeakable brutality. After ensuring the cabin was as secure as possible, Elias prepared to depart for the Ute village. He estimated he could reach it by nightfall if he traveled alone and pushed hard. Are you sure this is wise? Claire asked as he checked his weapons one final time. What if it's a trap and Dr. Warren is just separating us? Elias glanced at Warren, who stood across the cabin, helping Samuel and Maggie arrange blankets. He wrote on his slate, possible, but need Ute help regardless. Keep your pistol ready. Clara nodded grimly. We'll be on guard. How long should we wait for your return? 2 days, Elias wrote. If not back by sunset of second day, take children and go north to Fort Collins. Ask for Colonel Gardner. He knows me. Be careful, Clara said softly. We've already lost too much. Elias nodded, then knelt to say goodbye to the children. Annie threw her arms around his neck, an unexpected gesture that momentarily stunned him. Come back safe, she whispered. Lucy says you're a good man. Elias gently disentangled himself and ruffled the girl's golden curls. He shook hands solemnly with Thomas and Samuel, then patted Maggie's shoulder awkwardly. At the door, Warren stopped him. The Blackwoods won't give up easily, Elias. They have a reputation to maintain. Elias nodded in understanding. And Elias, Warren added quietly, I truly am trying to make amends. Whatever you may think of me, I won't harm them. Elias studied his former comrade's face for a long moment, then extended his hand. Whatever Warren's past sins, his warning had been genuine. That earned him a measure of trust, if not forgiveness. Warren clasped his hand firmly. Good luck, Captain. Elias slipped away from the cabin like a shadow, moving quickly but carefully through the snow-laden forest. He chose a different route than they had taken to arrive, intentionally creating a false trail that led away from both the cabin and his true destination. For 2 hours, he laid this false trail, sometimes doubling back, other times walking in the stream where the current had worn through the ice. Finally satisfied that he had created sufficient misdirection, he turned toward the Ute village, pushing his horse as hard as he dared on the treacherous terrain. By midday, he had covered substantial ground, navigating through high mountain passes where the wind had scoured the snow down to bare rock in places. He paused at a vantage point overlooking the valley they had left behind, scanning with his spyglass for any sign of pursuit. At first, he saw nothing but pristine wilderness. Then a flash of movement caught his eye, riders, at least 6 of them, following the very trail he had created to lead them astray. He focused the glass and recognized Jackson's distinctive gray-streaked hair beneath a fur cap. Beside him rode 2 men so similar in appearance they could only be the Blackwood brothers, lean, hard-faced men with the patient, predatory look of wolves. Elias felt a grim satisfaction. His deception was working, at least for now. It would buy Clara and the children precious time. He continued his journey, pushing deeper into the mountains where the Ute maintained their winter camp. The tribe had been forced to relocate multiple times as white settlers and mining operations encroached on their territory, but they still held this remote region, for now. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Elias approached the Ute village with caution. Relations between whites and the tribe were tenuous at best, and he had no desire to be mistaken for an intruder. He dismounted a respectful distance away and waited to be acknowledged. 2 mounted warriors appeared silently from the trees, rifles ready but not aimed directly at him. Elias recognized one of them, a young man called Swift Hawk, whom he had treated for a bullet wound the previous spring. "Medicine man who does not speak," Swift Hawk said in careful English. "Why do you come to our winter camp?" Elias raised his hands to show he came in peace, then slowly reached for his slate. He wrote a brief explanation of the situation and handed it to Swift Hawk. The warrior read it, his expression growing grave. "Maxwell," he spat the name like a curse. "He steals our land, poisons our water with his mining." Elias nodded in agreement. "And you shelter the wife of the man who would have exposed this theft? The man who was killed for speaking truth?" Again, Elias nodded. Swift Hawk conferred briefly with his companion in their native tongue, then turned back to Elias. "You will come. Walking Bear will want to hear this." They escorted Elias into the village, a collection of sturdy lodges arranged in a protective circle. Women paused in their work to watch his arrival, while children peered curiously from behind their mothers' skirts. Many recognized him from his previous visits to treat the sick and injured, and a few raised their hands in greeting. At the center of the village stood the largest lodge, its entrance decorated with symbols of healing and protection. From it emerged an elderly man wrapped in a blanket robe, his deeply lined face a map of wisdom and hardship. Walking Bear was the tribe's eldest medicine man and its most respected voice in council. "My brother returns to us," the old man said, his voice surprisingly strong despite his advanced years. "But not in peace, I think. If he has not stopped, our people will have no place left." He turned to Swift Hawk. "Gather 10 warriors. We leave at first light." Elias wrote, "There are hunters tracking us. Dangerous men." "The Blackwood brothers," Walking Bear said knowingly. "We have heard of these men. They hunt our people sometimes when the army offers bounties." His expression hardened. "But they have never hunted Ute in our own mountains. Here, we are the hunters." As arrangements were made for the rescue party, a young Ute woman brought Elias food, a bowl of stew and a piece of flat bread. He accepted gratefully, realizing he had not eaten since dawn. Walking Bear sat beside him. "You still carry your silence like a shield, medicine man. Has your spirit not healed in these 7 winters?" Elias looked at the old man in surprise. He had never spoken to Walking Bear or anyone else about why he did not speak. The medicine man smiled faintly. "Your eyes talk, even when your mouth does not. They speak of blood and death, of many men dying under your hands during the white man's great war against himself." He touched his own chest. "The wound is here, yeah? In the spirit, not the throat." Elias nodded slowly. "Perhaps it is time to let the wound breathe," Walking Bear suggested. "A festering spirit, like a festering wound, cannot heal if kept in darkness." Before Elias could respond, a commotion at the edge of the village drew their attention. A Ute scout was arriving at a gallop, his horse lathered despite the cold. He spoke rapidly to Swift Hawk, who immediately approached Walking Bear. "Riders approaching from the south," Swift Hawk reported. "Many men heavily armed, not soldiers. They fly no flag. They come toward our village with purpose." Walking Bear rose, suddenly looking every year of his advanced age. Maxwell grows bold indeed if he dares attack our winter camp. He turned to Elias. Your friends at the trapper's cabin? They may already be in danger. If Maxwell's men found your false trail, Elias felt a cold dread settle in his chest. He had underestimated Maxwell's resources and determination. The false trail had been discovered, and now both the Ute village and Clara's hiding place were threatened. He quickly wrote on his slate, "Must warn them." Walking Bear nodded. "Yes, Swift Hawk and 4 warriors will go with you. I will prepare our defense here." He grasped Elias's arm with surprising strength. "Ride hard, medicine man. The woman and her children must not fall into Maxwell's hands." As Elias mounted his horse, the gravity of the situation became clear. They were caught between 2 approaching forces, Maxwell's men coming from the south toward the Ute village, and likely the Blackwood brothers closing in on the trapper's cabin from the east. The sun was setting as they rode out, casting long shadows across the snow. Elias pushed his tired horse to its limits, dread building with every mile. He had left Clara and her children with Warren, trusting his former comrade's change of heart. Had that trust been misplaced? The answer came sooner than expected. As they crested a ridge overlooking the valley where the trapper's cabin stood, a distant sound reached them. Gunshots, echoing across the wilderness. In the fading light, Elias could make out figures moving around the cabin. Smoke rose not just from the chimney, but from one wall. The cabin was on fire. Swifthawk raised his rifle. "We attack?" Elias nodded grimly, checking his own weapons. The Hollander children were in that burning cabin, children he had sworn to protect. And Clara, a woman who had already lost too much to Maxwell's greed. As they prepared to descend into the valley, a lone figure emerged from the trees below. Thomas Hollander, running for his life with 2 mounted men in pursuit. The Blackwood brothers had found them, and the battle had already begun. Elias raised his rifle and took aim, breaking his years of silence with a war cry that tore from his throat like thunder, the first sound he had uttered since the blood-soaked fields of Antietam. It was not a word, but a primal declaration of rage and defiance that echoed across the valley. The hunt had become a war. The world narrowed to a single point of focus for Elias. Thomas Hollander running for his life through knee-deep snow, the Blackwood brothers closing in behind him. The boy stumbled, fell, and desperately scrambled back to his feet as his pursuers gained ground. Elias's rifle cracked in the frozen air, the bullet kicking up snow inches from the lead rider's horse. The animal reared in panic, nearly unseating its rider. It was a warning shot, precise and deliberate, giving Thomas the seconds he needed to reach the shelter of a fallen pine. Swift Hawk and his warriors fanned out along the ridgeline, their rifles trained on the scene below. "We have the high ground," the young Ute warrior observed, "but the cabin burns. The others may still be inside." Elias signaled for 2 warriors to circle around to the cabin while he and Swifthawk focused on rescuing Thomas. They descended the slope rapidly, using the trees for cover as they closed the distance. The Blackwood brothers had dismounted and taken positions on either side of Thomas's hiding place. They were methodical in their movements, communicating with hand signals that spoke of long experience hunting together. The older brother, a weather-beaten man with a distinctive scar across his cheek, gestured toward the ridge, having spotted the Ute warrior's approach. "Come out, boy," he called to Thomas. "We don't want to hurt you. Your mama's waiting back at the cabin." It was a crude attempt at deception. Elias could still see smoke rising from the cabin wall, and there was no sign of Clara or the other children. He motioned for Swift Hawk to move left while he circled right, creating a pincer movement around the Blackwoods. As he maneuvered through the trees, Elias's mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Had Warren betrayed them after all? Where were Clara, Samuel, Maggie, and little Annie? The thought of those children in danger ignited something primal within him, a protective fury he had not felt since the war. One of the Blackwoods fired toward Thomas's position, the bullet splintering wood above the boy's head. "That was a warning, son. Next one goes lower." Elias moved silently into position behind a massive pine, now within 30 yards of the younger Blackwood. He raised his rifle but hesitated. Killing, even in defense of the innocent, was a threshold he had not crossed since hanging up his uniform. As a surgeon, he had sworn to preserve life, not take it. The decision was made for him when Thomas broke cover, running desperately toward the tree line. The elder Blackwood raised his rifle, taking aim at the boy's back. Elias fired. The manhunter dropped like a stone, his unfired rifle falling into the snow beside him. The younger Blackwood whirled in shock, searching for the source of the shot. Swift Hawk's rifle barked from the opposite direction, the bullet striking a tree inches from the remaining Blackwood's head. "You're surrounded," Swift Hawk called out in clear English. "Drop your weapon." For a moment, it seemed the manhunter would comply. Then, with startling speed, he dove behind a boulder and returned fire, forcing Swift Hawk to take cover. Thomas had reached the tree line and now ran toward Elias, terror and exhaustion etched on his young face. Elias gestured frantically for the boy to stay low and continue past him toward the Ute warriors on the ridge. "Mr. Boone!" Thomas gasped as he reached him. "They came at dawn. Jackson and the Blackwoods. Dr. Warren tried to warn us, but they shot him. Mama took the others and ran out the back while I drew them away." Relief washed through Elias. Clara and the younger children had escaped. But Warren's betrayal or redemption remained unclear. "Go," Elias mouthed, pointing toward the ridge where 2 Ute warriors waited to receive the boy. "Safe there." Thomas hesitated. Mama went north along the stream, said to meet at the big rock shaped like a bear. Elias nodded in understanding. He had seen the formation Thomas described, a natural landmark about 2 miles upstream. The exchange of gunfire continued between Swift Hawk and the surviving Blackwood. Elias signaled to the Ute warrior that he would flank the manhunter from the opposite side. Moving through the trees with a hunter's stealth, Elias circled behind Blackwood's position. The manhunter was focused entirely on Swift Hawk, unaware of the threat approaching from his rear. When Elias was within 10 yards, he deliberately stepped on a dry branch. The crack brought Blackwood spinning around, his rifle swinging wildly. Elias was already diving forward, closing the distance before the manhunter could aim properly. They collided in the snow, the rifle discharging harmlessly into the air. What followed was a desperate struggle. 2 men of similar size and strength fighting in the confines of a narrow space between boulders. Blackwood was younger, but Elias had the advantage of righteous fury and years of wilderness hardship that had kept him strong despite his age. The manhunter landed a crushing blow to Elias's jaw, momentarily stunning him. As Blackwood reached for a knife at his belt, Elias drove his knee upward with all his strength. The man doubled over, and Elias brought his elbow down hard on the back of Blackwood's neck. The fight ended as suddenly as it had begun. Blackwood lay motionless in the blood-stained snow. Elias rose unsteadily to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps that clouded the air around him. Swift Hawk approached cautiously. "He is dead?" Elias checked for a pulse, then shook his head. "Unconscious, not dead." He gestured for Swift Hawk to bind the manhunter while he caught his breath. "The other warriors have reached the cabin," Swift Hawk reported as he secured Blackwood with leather thongs. "It burns, but slowly. The snow on the roof keeps it from spreading quickly." Elias nodded, then pointed upstream and made a walking motion with his fingers. "You go to find the woman and children? What of this one?" Swift Hawk nudged the unconscious Blackwood with his foot. Elias made a dragging motion, then pointed toward the ridge. "We will take him. He may have information about Maxwell's plans." Swift Hawk studied Elias's face. "You have broken your silence, medicine man. I heard your war cry." Elias touched his throat, surprised by the observation. The sound that had torn from him during Thomas's rescue had been involuntary, a primal response to the boy's danger. He had not spoken words, but it was the first sound he had intentionally made in 7 years. He had no time to consider the implications. Clara and the younger children were still in danger, potentially being tracked by Jackson and the remaining members of Maxwell's party. He had to find them before nightfall, or the bitter cold would become as deadly a threat as any bullet. With a nod of farewell to Swift Hawk, Elias set off upstream, following the half-frozen creek where Clara might have left tracks. The light was fading rapidly, the brief winter day yielding to what promised to be a brutal night. As he moved through the gathering darkness, Elias reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in just a few days. His solitary existence, the careful isolation he had built over 7 years, had been shattered by Clara Hollander and her children. Now he was once again in the midst of conflict, with lives depending on his actions. He found the first sign of Clara's passage about a mile upstream, a child's mitten caught on a branch overhanging the creek. It was Annie's, he was certain. He pocketed it and continued his tracking, eyes straining in the dim light. The rock formation Thomas had described came into view just as full darkness descended. A massive boulder weathered into a shape reminiscent of a bear standing on its hind legs. Elias approached cautiously, alert for any sign of Clara or the children. A small voice called out from the shadows beneath the rock. "Mr. Boone, is that you?" Samuel emerged from a narrow crevice at the base of the formation. The boy's face was smudged with soot, his eyes wide with relief. "Thomas?" he asked anxiously. "Did you find him?" Elias nodded and made a gesture to indicate Thomas was safe with the ute. "Mama's hurt," Samuel said, tugging at Elias's coat. "She told me to watch, to make sure it was you or Thomas before I came out." Elias followed the boy into the crevice, which widened into a small cave beneath the overhang. Clara sat against the rock wall, her face pale in the darkness. Maggie was curled against her side, while Annie slept fitfully in her lap. "Elias," Clara whispered, relief evident in her voice. "Thank God." "Thomas?" Elias made a gesture to indicate the boy was safe. "Dr. Warren?" she asked. Elias shook his head, not knowing Warren's fate but assuming the worst based on Thomas's report. "He tried to warn us," Clara said weakly. "Jackson shot him as he was helping us escape through the back. I don't know if he survived." She shifted, wincing in pain. "One of the Blackwoods caught up to us as we were running. He grabbed Annie, and when I fought him, She pulled aside her coat to reveal a blood-stained shirt. "Knife, not too deep, I think, but it won't stop bleeding." Elias knelt beside her, gently moving Annie to Maggie's care. He examined the wound by touch in the darkness, a slash across Clara's ribs that had thankfully missed any vital organs, but was indeed still seeping blood. He removed his neckerchief and bound it tightly around her torso as a temporary measure. "We can't stay here," Clara said through gritted teeth. "Jackson knows these mountains. He'll be looking for us." Elias nodded grimly. They needed to move, but Clara's condition complicated matters. She had already lost blood, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. Moving her wrist worsening her injury, but staying meant certain discovery or freezing. He made a decision, writing quickly on his slate by feel more than sight. "Must get you to Ute Camp. Can you ride?" "If it means keeping my children safe, I can do anything," Clara replied with quiet determination. Elias helped her to her feet, supporting most of her weight as they emerged from the shelter of the rock. The night sky had cleared, stars burning with cold fire above the mountains. The temperature had plummeted with the darkness, turning their breath to crystalline clouds. Samuel and Maggie followed, the girl carrying her sleeping younger sister. They looked to Elias with complete trust, these children who barely knew him. The responsibility settled on his shoulders like a physical weight. "The bad men took our horses when they found the cabin," Samuel informed him. "Mama said we had to go on foot." Elias had left his own horse with Swift Hawk during the confrontation with the Blackwoods. They would have to proceed on foot until they rejoined the Ute warriors. It was a daunting prospect given Clara's condition in the bitter cold. He fashioned a travois from branches in his coat, creating a sled-like conveyance that could carry Clara over the snow. It was crude but functional and would allow them to move more quickly than if she had to walk with her injury. As he worked, Elias kept a watchful eye on their surroundings. The night was silent except for the occasional crack of a frost-stressed tree and the soft breathing of the children. But the wilderness had taught him that silence often preceded danger. He was securing the last binding on the travois when he heard it, the distant but distinct sound of horses approaching from the south. Jackson had found their trail and it was closing in. Elias hurriedly loaded Clara onto the travois and motioned for the children to follow him. He pulled the travois himself, the leather harness biting into his shoulders as they moved as quickly and quietly as possible through the snow-laden forest. His only advantage was his intimate knowledge of this terrain in the cover of darkness. "Where are we going?" Samuel whispered, trotting alongside. Elias pointed northward, toward the higher peaks where the Ute winter camp was located. "That's so far," Maggie whimpered, struggling with Annie's weight. "I'm cold." Elias stopped briefly, removing his heavy wool shirt. Underneath, he wore only a thin undershirt, leaving him vulnerable to the bitter cold. But the children needed the warmth more. He wrapped his shirt around both girls, creating a shared cocoon of fabric that would help preserve their body heat. The sounds of pursuit grew louder behind them. Elias increased their pace, his muscles burning with the effort of pulling Clara through the deepening snow. They needed to find Swift Hawk and the warriors, or at least reach terrain where they could defend themselves. They had traveled perhaps a mile when disaster struck. The travois runner caught on a submerged log, snapping with a crack that seemed deafening in the quiet night. Clara stifled a cry of pain as she was jolted roughly to the ground. The sound might as well have been a signal fire. From behind them came shouts and the increased tempo of approaching horses. They had been discovered. Elias made a split-second decision. He scooped Annie from Maggie's arms and gestured urgently for the older children to help their mother into a dense thicket of pines ahead. It wasn't a perfect hiding place, but it offered some concealment. Meanwhile, he would lead the pursuers away, buying Clara and the children time to remain hidden or escape. "No," Clara protested weakly, understanding his intention. "They'll kill you." Elias squeezed her hand once firmly, then melted into the darkness with Annie. The smallest child was the most vulnerable to the cold and would have the hardest time staying silent. By taking her with him, he gave the others the best chance of remaining undiscovered. He moved perpendicular to their original path, intentionally leaving obvious tracks in the snow. Annie, now fully awake, clung to his neck but remained mercifully quiet, seeming to understand the need for silence. Behind him, he heard the pursuers reach the broken travois. Jackson's voice carried clearly through the night air. "They separated here. Hollander woman's hurt. She won't get far. You two follow that trail," presumably indicating the marks Elias had deliberately left. "Miller and I will keep looking for the woman." Elias quickened his pace, knowing he now had only 2 pursuers following him rather than 4. It improved the odds, but not by much. He was unarmed except for his hunting knife, carrying a child, and rapidly losing body heat without his shirt in the frigid night. Annie's small voice whispered in his ear, "Are the bad men coming?" Elias nodded. "Papa said sometimes you have to be very brave and very quiet when bad men are near," she confided. "I can be brave and quiet." Something twisted in Elias's chest. Grief for this child's lost father, admiration for her courage, and a fierce determination to ensure she survived to grow into the remarkable woman she would surely become. They reached a small rise overlooking a frozen pond. Elias paused, considering his options. The ice would leave no tracks, potentially confusing their pursuers, but it also offered no cover. Before he could decide, a voice called from the darkness behind them. "That's far enough, Boone." Elias turned slowly to find one of Maxwell's men emerging from the trees, rifle raised. The man was young, barely out of his teens, with a nervous tension evident in his stance. "Mr. Jackson says to bring the girl back unharmed," the young man continued. He doesn't care about." Elias carefully set Annie down behind him, positioning his body as a shield between her and the rifle. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," the man said, his voice betraying his inexperience. "That notebook ain't worth dying for." Elias stood his ground, unarmed but unwavering. Behind him, he felt Annie trembling against his leg. The young man's finger tightened on the trigger. "Last chance, mister. Step aside." What happened next occurred so swiftly that later, Elias could never fully reconstruct the sequence of events. A shadow detached itself from the trees behind the gunman. A human figure moving with lethal purpose. There was a brief struggle, the dull thud of a heavy object striking flesh, and then silence. Dr. Warren stepped into view, a blood-stained rock in his hand. The young guard lay motionless at his feet. "He's only unconscious," Warren said, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "I've had enough of death." The doctor looked terrible, pale and drawn, with a makeshift bandage wrapped around his upper arm. His city clothes were torn and caked with blood and dirt. But he was alive and apparently still committed to helping them. "We don't have much time," Warren continued. "Jackson and the other guard are circling back. They found the woman and other children hiding in the pines." Elias felt his heart drop. Clara, Thomas, Samuel, Maggie, captured. "They're taking them to Silverstone," Warren explained grimly. "Maxwell wants to make an example of them, and he wants that notebook." Annie clutched Elias's leg tighter. "Are the bad men going to hurt Mama?" Warren knelt to the child's level. "Not if we can help it, little one. Your mama is very brave, and so are you." He looked up at Elias. There's a Ute hunting party about a mile east of here. I encountered them while tracking you. They're led by a warrior named Swift Hawk. Elias nodded in recognition. We need their help, Warren said. Jackson has at least 15 armed men at Silverstone, and the mine itself is like a fortress. We can't free the Hollanders alone. Elias hesitated, studying Warren's face in the moonlight. The doctor seemed sincere, but he had been Maxwell's man for years. Could he be trusted now, when everything hung in the balance? I know you have no reason to trust me, Warren said, as if reading his thoughts. I've been a coward for too long, Elias. What I saw at Antietam broke something in you, made you retreat into silence. What I saw broke something in me too, but I responded by becoming numb to suffering, by looking the other way when men like Maxwell caused harm. He straightened, wincing at the pain from his wounded arm. I'm done looking away. After a moment's consideration, Elias extended his hand. Whatever Warren's past sins, his actions now spoke of redemption. And they needed every ally they could find if they were to rescue Clara and her children from Silverstone. Warren clasped his hand firmly, the gesture sealing their renewed alliance. Then he removed his coat and handed it to Elias. You'll freeze to death without something to cover you. That would be a poor way to repay your saving my life at Fredericksburg. They made their way eastward, following game trails through the moonlit forest. Annie, exhausted by the night's events, dozed against Elias's shoulder as he carried her. Warren moved with difficulty, his wound clearly causing him significant pain, but he pressed on without complaint. They found Swift Hawk and 4 warriors making their way toward the sound of the earlier confrontation. The young Ute leader's face showed relief at the sight of Elias. Medicine man, he greeted. We feared you were lost. Warren explained the situation rapidly. Clara and the other children captured and being taken to Silverstone, the imminent danger they faced from Maxwell's vengeance. Swift Hawk's expression darkened. The boy Thomas is safe with our people. We sent him to the village with the captured white man. He considered for a moment. Silverstone is a difficult place to attack. Many armed men, strong walls, only one approach. Maxwell will expect a rescue attempt, Warren agreed. He'll be prepared. Then we must do what is not expected, Swift Hawk declared. He turned to one of his warriors and issued instructions in their native tongue. The man nodded and departed silently into the forest. I have sent for more warriors, Swift Hawk explained, and for Walking Bear. The old one knows secrets about the mountain where Silverstone sits, ancient passages beneath the earth, ways in that Maxwell does not know. Elias glanced at Warren questioningly. It's possible, the doctor confirmed. The mine tunnels extend far into the mountain. There are old shafts, abandoned works from earlier operations. Maxwell sealed many of them for safety, but Walking Bear's people have lived here for generations. They might know ways in that aren't on any mining map. Swift Hawk directed his warriors to make camp in a sheltered hollow. One of them took charge of Annie, wrapping her in warm furs and settling her near a small, nearly smokeless fire. The child, displaying remarkable resilience, soon fell into exhausted sleep. While they waited for reinforcements, Warren shared what he knew of Silverstone's defenses and Maxwell's likely intentions. He's desperate, the doctor explained. The evidence in Van Hollander's notebook would not only expose the illegal mining on Ute land, but reveal financial fraud that would ruin him. He's been skimming profits for years, reporting less silver production than actual to his eastern investors. And the territorial governor is involved? Swift Hawk asked. Warren nodded grimly. Along with Indian Agent Harrington and Judge Caldwell in Denver, it's a well-established network of corruption. Maxwell believes that if he can eliminate the Hollander family and recover the notebook, he can preserve it all. Elias listened intently, his mind working through the tactical implications. Silverstone wasn't just a mine, it was the center of a criminal conspiracy with tentacles reaching to the highest levels of territorial government. Any rescue attempt would need to not only free Clara and the children, but secure the evidence in a way that would ensure justice. He took out his slate and wrote, Need federal marshals, outside authority. Warren shook his head. The nearest federal marshal who isn't in Maxwell's pocket is in Cheyenne, 3 days hard ride. Clara and the children don't have that long. Swift Hawk studied the night sky, gauging the time. Walking Bear will arrive before dawn. We will make our plan then. For now, rest. The coming day will demand all our strength. Elias couldn't rest. While the others settled around the small fire, he moved to the edge of their camp, staring in the direction of Silverstone. Somewhere in that fortress-like mine, Clara and her children were prisoners, their lives hanging by the slenderest of threads. The thought of them and Maxwell's power filled him with a cold rage unlike anything he had felt since the war. Warren joined him after a time, offering a cup of coffee from the warrior's supplies. "You should conserve your strength," he advised. "There will be fighting tomorrow." Elias accepted the coffee but made no move to return to the fire. "You care for them," Warren observed. "The Hollander woman and her children. It's more than just the principle of the thing for you now." Elias didn't respond, but his silence was confirmation enough. "I understand," Warren continued. "They've awakened something in you, something you thought died with your family during the fever." Elias turned sharply, surprised by Warren's knowledge of his personal tragedy. "I made inquiries over the years," the doctor explained. "After you disappeared from Philadelphia, I heard about your wife and son, about how you couldn't save them despite all your medical knowledge." He paused. "No doctor could have, Elias. That fever took the best physicians in the city." Elias looked away, the old grief rising like a tide within him. 7 years had dulled its edge, but the core remained. The sense of helplessness, of failure in his most sacred duty to protect those he loved. "You couldn't save your family," Warren said quietly, "but you might be able to save hers. If you're willing to break your silence, to become fully who you once were." Captain Elias Boone, a man who led others and spoke with authority. The challenge hung in the air between them. Elias had maintained his silence for 7 years, a self-imposed penance for failures both real and imagined. He had retreated from the world, from connection, from the terrible responsibility of holding others' lives in his hands. But now, with Clara and her children in peril, that silence had become not a shield, but a shackle. To lead the coming rescue, to coordinate between Warren, Swifthawk, and Walking Bear, he would need more than gestures and written words. He would need his voice. Elias opened his mouth, feeling the rusty hinges of disuse. No sound emerged at first, just the steam of his breath in the cold night air. Then, with effort that seemed to tear something loose within his chest, he formed a word, the first he had spoken aloud in 7 years. "Tomorrow." The word hung in the air, rough-edged and barely audible, but unmistakably his voice. Warren's eyes widened. "Elias?" "Tomorrow," Elias repeated, his voice stronger now, though still hoarse with disuse. "We end this." The simple declaration marked a transformation as profound as any physical metamorphosis. Captain Elias Boone, surgeon, soldier, leader of men, was awakening from his long silence, and Maxwell would soon discover the terrible cost of threatening those under his protection. As if in response to this inner shift, the night around them changed. A soft glow appeared on the eastern horizon, not the dawn, still hours away, but a distant light that should not exist in this wilderness. Swifthawk appeared at their side, his expression grim. "Silverstone," he said, pointing to the glow. "It burns." Through his spyglass, Elias confirmed the young warrior's assessment. The mine complex was ablaze, flames leaping from buildings at the heart of the operation. Even at this distance, he could make out tiny figures moving frantically around the fire. "Maxwell wouldn't burn his own operation," Warren said, confusion evident in his voice. "It doesn't make sense." A terrible suspicion formed in Elias's mind. He lowered the spyglass, his newly rediscovered voice emerging in a harsh whisper. "Clara." Warren's face paled as he grasped the implication. "You think she started the fire? As a diversion?" Swifthawk nodded slowly, respect evident in his expression. "The woman is warrior-hearted. She creates chaos to protect her young." "Or Maxwell is eliminating evidence," Warren countered darkly, "burning everything including witnesses." Either possibility demanded immediate action. Elias turned to Swifthawk. "We move now. No waiting for dawn." The young warrior nodded his agreement. "I will prepare my men." As Swifthawk roused his warriors, Elias knelt beside the sleeping Annie. The child stirred at his touch, her eyes opening sleepily. "Mr. Boone?" she murmured, then sat bolt upright in surprise. "You talked." "Yes," he said softly, his voice still rough but strengthening with use. "Annie, I need you to be brave a little longer. We're going to get your mama and brothers and sister. You'll stay here with one of Swifthawk's men where it's safe." The child's expression turned mutinous. I want to come. I can be brave. I know you can, Elias assured her, but I need you to be safe most of all. Your mama needs to know you're safe so she can be brave too. This reasoning seemed to satisfy the child. She settled back into her furs with a solemn nod. Promise you'll bring them back? Elias hesitated. It was a promise he might not be able to keep, given what they were about to attempt. But looking into those trusting eyes, he found he could not deny her hope. I promise to do everything in my power, he said carefully. Now sleep. When you wake, this will all be over. As he rejoined Warren and Swifthawk, a new figure emerged from the darkness. Walking Bear, accompanied by a dozen Ute warriors. The old medicine man's face was grave, his eyes reflecting the distant firelight. The mountain weeps fire, he observed. Maxwell has awakened ancient anger. We need to reach Silverstone quickly, Warren urged. If that fire reaches the main shaft, the entire mine could collapse. Walking Bear nodded thoughtfully. There is a way, a passage through the mountain that my grandfather showed me as a boy. It emerges within the mine itself, in tunnels abandoned long ago by the first white miners. Elias felt a surge of hope. Can you lead us? I can, the old man confirmed. But the path is difficult, and there is danger beyond what you can see. The mountain does not give up its silver easily. It exacts a price from those who take without asking. He fixed Elias with a penetrating gaze. Are you prepared to pay such a price, medicine man who now speaks? The question carried weight beyond its simple words, a recognition that what they were about to attempt might require the ultimate sacrifice. Elias thought of Clara and her children, of the corruption that had already claimed John Hollander's life, of the silence he had hidden behind for 7 long years. Yes, he said firmly, his voice growing stronger with each word. Whatever it costs. Walking Bear nodded once, satisfied. Then we go to the mountain's heart, where silver and fire dance together. As they prepared to depart, leaving Annie in the care of a trusted warrior, Elias felt a strange calm descend upon him. The paralysis of grief that had held him for 7 years had broken. Whatever happened at Silverstone, whether they succeeded in rescuing Clara and her children or failed in the attempt, he was finally moving forward. They set out toward the burning mine, following Walking Bear through ancient paths known only to the Ute. Behind them, Annie slept beneath the watchful stars, clutching her doll Lucy to her chest, the innocent vessel that contained the evidence of corruption and murder. And within that doll, secrets that would change the Colorado Territory forever. The ancient passage into Silverstone Mountain was little more than a fissure in the rock face, obscured by scrub pine and centuries of fallen debris. Had Walking Bear not led them directly to it, Elias doubted anyone could have found the entrance. The old medicine man paused before the narrow opening, his weathered hand tracing symbols carved into the stone, markings so old they had nearly eroded away. My ancestors knew this mountain before the first white man set foot in these lands, Walking Bear said solemnly. They took only the silver they needed for adornment in sacred vessels, always with proper offerings and gratitude. His eyes reflected the distant glow of the burning mine. They never tore open the mountain's heart as Maxwell has done. Elias studied the narrow crevice with a soldier's tactical assessment. How far to the mine workings? The path winds for nearly a mile through the mountain's bones, Walking Bear replied. It will bring us beneath the main shaft, where the oldest tunnels meet the new. Warren stepped forward, his medical bag slung over his shoulder alongside a borrowed rifle. The fire appears to be beneath the surface buildings, processing, works, offices. The main shaft may still be intact, but not for long. Mines like this are ventilated with wooden air shafts that will act like chimneys in a fire. Swifthawk had divided his warriors. 6 would accompany them through the passage, while the others circled around to approach the mine from the main entrance, creating a diversion when needed. We should move quickly, the young warrior advised. The fire draws attention. Men will be focused on fighting it, not guarding prisoners. Elias nodded in agreement. He turned to Walking Bear. Lead us. The old man lit a small torch of pine resin and ducked into the narrow opening. One by one they followed, entering the ancient passageway in single file. The air inside was surprisingly warm and carried a faint mineral scent. The walls glistened with moisture, occasionally revealing streaks of quartz that caught the termite. As they penetrated deeper into the mountain, the passage widened slightly, but remained low enough that Elias had to stoop. His newly rediscovered voice emerged in a whisper, echoing strangely in the confined space. "How did your people discover this path?" Walking Bear's voice drifted back from the darkness ahead. "It was not discovered, Medicine Man. It was shown to us by Mountain Spirit many generations ago, when the great drought drove our people to seek water in the earth's depths. We found both water and silver, gifts from the mountain." They continued in silence for what seemed an eternity, the only sounds their careful footsteps and the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. The air grew warmer, and a faint vibration could be felt through the rock, the distant working of the mine's machinery, still operational despite the fire above. Abruptly, Walking Bear halted. "Listen." They froze, straining their ears in the darkness. At first, Elias heard nothing beyond the soft breathing of their party. Then it came, a rhythmic tapping, faint but distinct, emanating from the rock itself. "Miners?" Warren suggested. Walking Bear shook his head. "The sound comes from deeper than Maxwell's men have dug. It is the mountain's pulse." Swifthawk was less mystical in his assessment. "Something is wrong. The rhythm is too regular for natural settling." Elias pressed his hand against the wall, feeling the vibration. His years as a surgeon had trained him to recognize patterns, to diagnose based on rhythm and regularity. This was no natural geological phenomenon. "Blasting charges," he concluded grimly. "Sequential detonations, likely set on timers." Warren's face paled in the torchlight. "Maxwell's destroying the mine." "With my family inside?" Swifthawk questioned incredulously. "If he's desperate enough to eliminate all evidence—" Warren didn't need to finish the thought. Elias's newly recovered voice took on a tone of command. "How much further, Walking Bear?" "The passage joins the mine workings just ahead. But if blasting has begun—" "We continue," Elias interrupted firmly. "Now." They pressed forward with renewed urgency, the tapping growing louder as they progressed. The ancient passage began to show signs of more recent disturbance, crude tool marks on the walls, an abandoned lantern lying broken on the floor. They were nearing the intersection with the commercial mine. Walking Bear stopped before a pile of loose rock that appeared to block the passage completely. "Beyond this lies Maxwell's realm. The vibrations suggest the wall between may be thin here, perhaps broken by recent blasting." Swifthawk and two warriors immediately began clearing the debris, working quickly but cautiously to avoid triggering a collapse. As the rocks were moved aside, a draft of warm air flowed through the opening, carrying the acrid smell of smoke and gunpowder. When the gap was wide enough, Walking Bear extinguished his torch. "From here, we move in darkness. Maxwell's tunnels will have lanterns." Elias was the first to squeeze through the opening, emerging into a roughly hewn mining tunnel supported by timber braces. The difference between the ancient natural passage and this man-made intrusion was stark. The latter bore the scars of violent extraction, the rock hacked and blasted apart with little regard for its integrity. A faint glow of lantern light came from around a bend in the tunnel about 50 yards ahead. Elias motioned for the others to remain quiet as they filed through the opening. Once all had assembled in the mine tunnel, he outlined his plan in hushed tones. "Warren, you know the mine layout. Where would Maxwell hold prisoners?" The doctor considered the question. "The assay office has a strong room for securing valuable ore samples. It's near the main shaft, one level up from here." "And the blasting charges?" "If he's trying to destroy evidence, he'd focus on the illegal tunnels that extend under Ute land. They branch eastward from the main shaft on this level." Elias absorbed this information with a soldier's efficiency. "Swifthawk, take 3 warriors and locate those charges. Disable them if possible, but your priority is to find Clara and the children." The young Ute nodded grimly. "And you, Captain?" "Walking Bear, Warren, and I will head for the assay office with the remaining warriors. We'll converge at the main shaft, regardless of what we find." As they prepared to separate, a deep rumble shook the tunnel, dislodging dust and small rocks from the ceiling. The sequential tapping they had heard earlier had stopped, replaced by a more ominous silence. "The blasting sequence has paused," Warren observed. "They typically set charges in stages to control the collapse, which means we have limited time before the next sequence begins," Elias concluded. He met each man's eyes in the dim light. Move fast, stay alert. Maxwell's men will be armed and desperate. With a final nod, Swifthawk led his group eastward toward the illegal tunnels, while Elias directed his team toward a rough-hewn ladder that led upward to the next level. As he climbed, he felt the weight of command settling back onto his shoulders, a familiar burden he had carried through the bloodiest battles of the Civil War and abandoned in its aftermath. Now, with lives once again in his hands, he found that his body remembered what his mind had tried to forget. The upper level was better constructed, with squared timber supports and a plank floor. The smell of smoke was stronger here, seeping through ventilation shafts from the burning buildings above. Somewhere in the distance, they could hear shouting, miners fighting the fire or evacuating the complex. Warren took the lead, guiding them through a maze of tunnels toward the central operations. The assay office should be just ahead, near the main shaft elevator. They rounded a corner and found themselves facing two armed guards, standing outside a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bands. The men were clearly nervous, glancing repeatedly toward the main shaft where smoke was beginning to billow downward. Elias held up a hand, stopping his group just before they would have been visible. He turned to Walking Bear and the warriors, indicating they should circle around if possible to flank the guards. As the Utes slipped away to find an alternate approach, Elias considered their options. A direct confrontation risked gunfire that could harm Clara and the children if they were indeed behind that door. But time was running out. The increasing smoke suggested the fire was spreading deeper into the mine. Warren leaned close, whispering, "I could approach openly. They know me." Elias shook his head. If Maxwell had ordered the mine destroyed, the doctor's betrayal was likely known by now. Before they could formulate a plan, the decision was made for them. One of the guards suddenly stiffened, listening to a sound from within the room. He unlocked the door and disappeared inside, leaving his companion alone in the corridor. Elias seized the opportunity. He emerged from concealment and walked directly toward the remaining guard, his stride purposeful, his bearing that of a man with every right to be there. The guard raised his rifle uncertainly. "Hold up there! Who are you?" "Captain Elias Boone," he replied, his voice stronger now with use. "Federal Marshal's office. I'm here about the Hollander situation." The bluff was bold but calculated. In the confusion of the fire and evacuation, with smoke increasingly filling the tunnel, the guard might not question the sudden appearance of federal authority. The guard hesitated, his rifle lowering slightly. "Marshal's office?" Maxwell didn't say nothing about. That moment of uncertainty was all Elias needed. He closed the remaining distance in 3 swift strides and struck with practiced precision, a short, powerful blow to the throat that left the man gasping and incapacitated without raising an alarm. As Warren hurried forward to secure the fallen guard, Walking Bear and his warriors reappeared from a side tunnel, nodding their approval of Elias's efficient takedown. The door to the assay office stood partially open. From within came the sound of an argument, a woman's voice, strained but defiant, and a man's harsh with barely contained fury. "The fire's spreading, Maxwell. Do you intend to burn alive with us just to keep your secrets?" Clara's voice unmistakably. Elias felt a surge of relief that quickly gave way to renewed urgency. She was alive, but clearly in immediate danger. He pressed himself against the wall beside the door, signaling for the others to prepare. Then, with a deep breath, he risked a glance through the narrow opening. The assay office was a large room dominated by a central work table covered with scales, crucibles, and testing equipment. Clara stood with her back to the table, her wounded side clearly paining her, but her posture unbowed. Samuel and Maggie huddled behind her, their young faces streaked with tears but showing remarkable courage. Facing them was Ezra Maxwell himself, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with the hard features of someone accustomed to taking what he wanted. His expensive suit was stained with smoke, and his face flushed with anger. The guard who had entered earlier stood nearby, along with Jackson, the foreman whose brutal reputation preceded him. "The notebook, Mrs. Hollander," Maxwell was saying, his voice tight with controlled fury. "For the last time, where is it?" "In Denver, with the federal marshal," Clara lied smoothly. "John sent copies before you murdered him." "It's over, Maxwell." The mine owner's laugh held no humor. "A convenient tale, but we both know John didn't have time to make copies." He drew a revolver from his coat. Perhaps your children's lives are worth more to you than this pointless defiance. Elias had seen enough. He signaled to Walking Bear and the warriors to be ready, then caught Warren's eye and indicated the guard. The doctor nodded in understanding. He would deal with the armed guard while Elias focused on Maxwell himself. With a silent count of 3, Elias threw open the door and burst into the room, Warren and the Ute warriors close behind. "Federal Marshal's office," Elias announced, his voice carrying the authority of his former military rank. "Lower your weapons immediately." The moment of stunned surprise worked to their advantage. The guard hesitated just long enough for one of the Ute to tackle him, driving him to the ground. Jackson reached for his pistol but froze when Walking Bear's knife pressed against his throat. Only Maxwell retained his composure, keeping his revolver trained on Clara. "Captain Boone," he said with cold recognition, "Dr. Warren informed me you had survived the war. How disappointing to find you interfering in private business matters." "Kidnapping and murder are hardly private business," Elias replied, steadily advancing into the room. "It's over, Maxwell. The mine is burning above us, and charges are set below. Your operation is finished." Maxwell's eyes narrowed. "Perhaps, but I can still ensure the Hollander woman joins her husband." His finger tightened on the trigger. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Elias lunged forward as Samuel suddenly broke from behind his mother, throwing himself at Maxwell with a child's desperate courage. The gun discharged, the sound deafening in the confined space. Clara screamed her son's name. Elias tackled Maxwell to the ground, the revolver skittering across the floor. His fist connected with the mine owner's jaw once, twice. Hard, calculated blows meant to incapacitate without killing. Only when Maxwell lay unconscious did Elias turn to assess the aftermath. Samuel stood trembling, but unharmed. The boy's brave action had disrupted Maxwell's aim, sending the bullet into the ceiling. Clara gathered both her children into her arms, her eyes meeting Elias's over their heads. In that gaze he read relief, gratitude, and something deeper that mirrored his own growing feelings. Warren was already securing Maxwell with rope from the assay equipment, while Walking Bear and his warriors bound Jackson and the guard. The immediate threat was neutralized, but Elias knew their danger was far from over. "The charges," he reminded them, "and the fire spreading from above." As if summoned by his words, another rumble shook the tunnel, stronger than before or more. Dust and small rocks showered from the ceiling. The structural integrity of the mine was failing. "We need to evacuate now," Warren urged. "The main shaft elevator might still be operational." Clara gathered her children close. "Thomas and Annie? Are they safe?" "Both safe," Elias assured her. "Thomas is with the Ute village, and Annie is sheltered nearby with a warrior guard." Relief flooded Clara's face, quickly replaced by determination. "Then let's get out of this hellhole." They moved as a group toward the main shaft, Elias and Warren half carrying the unconscious Maxwell between them. Walking Bear and his warriors handled Jackson and the guard. Clara maintained a protective arm around her children despite her injury, her face set with resolve. As they approached the central shaft, they encountered miners fleeing upward, using the maintenance ladders alongside the elevator shaft. The elevator itself hung motionless, its cable system likely damaged by the fire above. "The ladders are our only option," Warren concluded, eyeing the narrow wooden structures that zigzagged up the shaft wall. Smoke poured downward through the shaft, growing thicker by the minute. Elias made a quick decision. "We'll need to leave the prisoners. They'll slow us too much on the ladders." "We can't just leave them to tea," Warren protested. "Secure them here with enough slack to reach the ladders if they regain consciousness," Elias compromised. "Their fate is in their own hands, as John Hollander's was in theirs." As Warren and the warriors bound the unconscious men to support beams with extended ropes, another series of explosions rocked the mine, closer this time and more powerful. The illegal eastern tunnels were collapsing, which meant Swifthawk and his group were either successful in disarming some charges or potentially caught in the destruction. "We can't wait," Elias decided reluctantly. "Start climbing. Walking Bear, help Clara and the children. Warren and I will follow." They had just begun their ascent when Swifthawk appeared, emerging from a side tunnel with only one warrior beside him. The young Ute's face was streaked with dust and blood, his expression grim. "The eastern tunnels are collapsing," he reported. "We disabled what charges we could, but some were already triggered. 2 of my men were lost in a cave-in. Elias absorbed this news with a heavy heart. More lives claimed by Maxwell's greed. And the remaining charges? Set to detonate in sequence. Minutes, perhaps, before the central shaft is compromised. There was no time for mourning now. Elias directed Swifthawk and his remaining warrior to join the evacuation up the ladders, which were already becoming crowded with fleeing miners. The climb was arduous, made more difficult by the increasing smoke and the periodic shuddering of the mine structure. Clara struggled visibly, her knife wound reopening with the strain of climbing. Samuel and Maggie showed remarkable resilience, ascending steadily despite their exhaustion and fear. They had climbed perhaps halfway to the surface when a massive explosion rocked the shaft, far more powerful than the previous blasts. The ladder beneath Elias shuddered violently, one of its rungs splintering under his weight. Below, a section of tunnel collapsed entirely, sending a cloud of dust and debris billowing upward. "Move faster," he urged those above him. "The whole structure is failing." Through the smoke and chaos, they climbed desperately toward the faint gray light that marked the surface. Miners pushed past them in panic, creating dangerous congestion on the narrow ladders. Twice, Elias had to grab Clara as she nearly lost her grip, her strength fading as blood seeped through her bandaged side. Just as they neared the top, a final devastating blast shook the entire mine. The ladder section beneath Warren gave way completely, leaving the doctor dangling from a broken rung, his legs swinging over the abyss that had claimed the lower levels of the mine. "Elias!" he cried, his grip slipping. Without hesitation, Elias descended to Warren's position, bracing himself against the shaft wall. "Give me your hand." For a suspended moment, as their hands clasped in the smoke-filled air, they were transported back to another time, to a blood-soaked battlefield at Fredericksburg, where Elias had similarly reached out to a fallen Warren. Now, as then, their grip held firm against the pull of death. With straining muscles, Elias pulled his friend to safety, guiding him to a secure section of ladder. Above them, Clara and her children had reached the surface, helped by Walking Bear and Swifthawk. Only they remained in the failing mine shaft. "Go!" Elias urged Warren. "I'm right behind you." The final climb was a blur of smoke, heat, and the ominous groan of timber supports reaching their breaking point. As Elias emerged into the open air, he was greeted by a scene of apocalyptic destruction. The entire Silverstone complex was engulfed in flames, buildings collapsing as the fire consumed decades of dried timber and stored explosives. Warren collapsed onto the ground beside him, coughing violently as his lungs expelled the toxic mine air. Around them, miners scattered in all directions, fleeing the destruction of what had been both their livelihood and, for many, their home. Clara rushed to Elias's side, her children clinging to her skirts. "You made it," she breathed, relief evident in her voice despite her obvious pain. Elias nodded, still catching his breath. "Swifthawk, Walking Bear?" "Here, Captain," Swifthawk answered, approaching with the old medicine man and the remaining warriors. "But we must move farther from the mine. The ground itself is becoming unstable." As if to emphasize his warning, a section of earth near the main shaft suddenly subsided, creating a sinkhole that swallowed an equipment shed in a matter of seconds. They retreated to a safe distance, watching as Silverstone Mine, the empire Ezra Maxwell had built through corruption and murder, literally collapsed in upon itself. The irony was not lost on Elias. In his desperation to destroy evidence, Maxwell had instead ensured the complete destruction of his criminal enterprise. "Maxwell and Jackson?" Clara asked as they gathered on a ridge overlooking the devastation. "If they regained consciousness in time, they may have escaped up other ladders," Warren replied. "If not," he left the alternative unspoken. Elias surveyed their group, battered, exhausted, but alive. Clara leaned heavily against him, her wound clearly requiring immediate attention. Samuel and Maggie sat nearby, their young faces reflecting a mixture of trauma and relief. Walking Bear and Swifthawk conferred quietly with their warriors, while Warren tended to minor injuries. "We need to get Clara to proper medical care," Elias said, his voice growing stronger with each use, "and reunite the children with Thomas and Annie." Swifthawk nodded. "Our village is closest. We have medicines, shelter, food." "And then," Clara asked quietly, looking up at Elias, "what happens after we heal?" It was a question that extended beyond their immediate circumstances, a question about future paths, about what would follow this crucible they had endured together. Elias felt the weight of it, the implicit choice it presented. Before he could respond, a new sound reached them. Horses approaching from the north, moving at speed. Swift Hawk's warriors immediately took defensive positions, rifles ready. Through his spyglass, Elias observed the approaching riders, at least a dozen men, well-armed and riding in formation. Not Maxwell's men, who would have been scattered by the mine's destruction. Something about their discipline seemed familiar to his soldier's eye. Cavalry, he concluded aloud. U.S. Army, by the look of them. Warren frowned in confusion. The nearest army post is Fort Collins. What would bring them here? The answer appeared as the riders drew closer. At their head rode a figure Elias recognized immediately. Colonel James Gardner, commander of the Fort Collins garrison, and more importantly, a former officer from the 20th Maine who had served with Elias during the war. I sent a rider to the fort before joining you at the trapper's cabin, Warren admitted. I wasn't certain they would respond in time, or at all. As the cavalry unit reached their position, Colonel Gardner dismounted and approached, his weathered face registering shock as he recognized Elias. Captain Boone, he said, removing his hat, they told me you were involved, but I scarcely believed it. We all thought you dead these past years. Elias straightened, finding himself instinctively falling back into military bearing. Colonel Gardner, your timing is fortunate. Gardner surveyed the smoking ruin of Silverstone Mine with a professional eye. Appears I missed out quite a confrontation. His gaze shifted to Clara and the children, to Walking Bear and his warriors, then back to Elias. I received a rather extraordinary message about illegal mining, corruption, and attempted murder. Dr. Warren's dispatch mentioned evidence? Clara stepped forward, despite her weakened condition. My husband documented everything, Colonel. The notebook is hidden inside my daughter's doll, which is currently with our youngest, Annie. Gardner's eyebrows rose slightly. A child's doll, clever hiding place. He turned to one of his officers. Lieutenant, dispatch 2 men to retrieve this evidence. Dr. Warren can provide the location. To Elias, he added, in the meantime, I believe you all require medical attention and rest. We've brought supplies and additional horses. As the soldiers established a temporary camp, and the regiment's surgeon began treating Clara's wound, Elias found himself standing apart, watching the aftermath of the destruction they had narrowly escaped. The once mighty Silverstone operation was now little more than a smoking crater in the mountainside, its hidden corruption finally exposed to daylight. Colonel Gardner joined him, offering a flask of whiskey, which Elias declined with a shake of his head. 7 years of silence, the colonel observed. Warren mentioned you hadn't spoken since Antietam. Yet here you are, giving orders and making reports as if no time has passed. Some things never leave you, Elias replied, his voice still rough, but gaining strength. For better or worse. And now, what will Captain Elias Boone do with his reclaimed voice? It was a profound question, one that Elias had been asking himself since the first word broke through his years of self-imposed silence. His gaze drifted to Clara, who sat with her children as the army surgeon tended her wound. She looked up, meeting his eyes across the distance, a question in her expression that mirrored Gardner's. The destruction of Silverstone had closed one chapter, but what came next remained unwritten. The evidence in Annie's doll would ensure justice for John Hollander and protection for the Ute lands. But the future beyond that justice hung in the balance. As Elias contemplated his answer, a distant figure emerged from the tree line north of their position, a Ute warrior leading 2 horses. Behind him, riding double on one mount, were Thomas and Annie Hollander. Annie spotted him immediately, waving frantically and calling out, Mr. Boone! Mr. Boone! We heard the mountain break! The little girl's voice carried across the clearing, drawing all eyes to the arriving children. Clara rose unsteadily to her feet, her face transformed by the sight of her oldest and youngest safe and whole. What followed was a reunion that moved even the hardened cavalry soldiers to turn away in respect for its privacy. Clara gathered all 4 of her children into her arms, weeping openly as they clung to her and to each other. Words tumbled out between sobs, reassurances, expressions of love, promises never to be separated again. Elias watched from a distance, reluctant to intrude on this sacred moment. But Annie, spotting him, broke away from the family circle and ran to him, her doll clutched tightly in one hand. "Mr. Boone, you kept your promise. You found Mama and Samuel and Maggie." She threw her arms around his waist, her small body warm and vital against him. Then looking up with solemn eyes, she added, "And Lucy says thank you for your brave voice." Elias knelt to the child's level, gently accepting the doll she thrust toward him. "Lucy was very brave too," he said, his voice gaining strength and resonance with each word. "She kept your father's important work safe." Annie nodded sagely. "Papa said sometimes the most important things are kept in the most ordinary places." She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Are you going to be our new papa now?" The question, delivered with a child's directness, struck Elias to his core. Before he could formulate a response, Clara appeared beside them, her other children close behind. "Annie," she chided gently, "that's not something to ask right now." But the question hung in the air between them, unavoidable in its implication. Elias rose to his feet, still holding Lucy the doll, now revealed as the repository of justice that had cost John Hollander his life. "The evidence is secure," he said, addressing both Clara and Colonel Gardner, who had approached with Warren. "Gino's work won't be in vain." Gardner accepted the doll with appropriate solemnity. "We'll ensure this reaches the proper federal authorities. The territorial governor and his corrupt officials won't escape justice." "And Maxwell?" Clara asked. "Jackson?" "No sign of them yet in the survivors," the colonel replied. "But we'll keep searching." As the conversation turned to practical matters of statements and testimony, Elias found himself drawn slightly apart, his mind processing the extraordinary events of the past days. He had broken a silence of 7 years, confronted enemies both external and internal, and found himself reconnected to life in ways he had thought permanently severed after losing his family. Warren joined him, his medical bag in hand. "The Army surgeon has stabilized Clara's wound, but she'll need rest and careful monitoring. The children are remarkably resilient, though they'll carry these memories for life." Elias nodded, watching as Thomas organized his younger siblings to help the soldiers gather firewood. Already the man of the family, but now with the freedom to still be partly a boy. "What will you do now, Elias?" Warren asked, echoing Colonel Gardner's earlier question. "Return to your cabin? To medicine?" Before Elias could answer, Walking Bear approached, his ancient face serene despite the chaos they had endured. "The mountain has spoken," the old medicine man observed cryptically. "It has buried corruption and revealed truth. But the mountain's voice is not the only one that needed to be heard." He fixed Elias with his penetrating gaze. "You have found your voice again, medicine man. Now you must decide what song it will sing." The metaphor struck Elias as profoundly apt. His voice, silent for so long, had emerged in defense of those who needed protection. But what would it say now in the aftermath? What life would he choose to speak into existence? As twilight descended upon the mountains, with army tents erected and cooking fires blazing, Elias found himself standing at a crossroads more significant than any he had faced since the war. Behind him lay 7 years of silence and solitude. Before him, possibilities he had long denied himself. Connection, purpose, perhaps even love. Clara approached, having left her children temporarily in Thomas's care. She stood beside him, watching the sun sink behind the western peaks. "They tell me we'll need to travel to Denver," she said quietly, "to give testimony about what happened here." Elias nodded. "Justice requires witnesses." And after that, she let the thought hang unfinished, an echo of Annie's innocent question about the future. In the gathering darkness, with the destroyed mind smoldering behind them and an uncertain path ahead, Elias faced the choice that had been building since he first found Clara and her children in the snow. It was a choice about silence and speech, about isolation and connection, about past grief and future possibility. As the first stars appeared above the mountains, he turned to Clara, his voice low but clear in the evening stillness. After that, he began, "We decide what comes next, together, if you're willing." Clara's eyes glistened in the firelight, hope and caution mingling in their depths. "Are you certain? My children and I come with complications, with a past that won't simply disappear." "As do I," Elias acknowledged, "but perhaps that's where healing begins, not in forgetting the past, but in building something new alongside it." Behind them, Annie's delighted laugh rang out as one of the soldiers showed the children a coin trick. The sound carried on the night air, a reminder of the resilience of young hearts, even in the shadow of tragedy. Clara's hand found Elias's in the darkness, her fingers intertwining with his. No words were spoken, but in that simple contact lay acceptance, possibility, and the first tentative step toward a future neither had imagined possible days before. As they stood together beneath the vast Colorado sky, the burning mountain at their backs and the children's voices carrying on the wind, the silence that had defined Elias for 7 years gave way completely to something new. Not just the technical ability to speak, but the courage to envision a life worth speaking about. The mountain had indeed revealed truth, as Walking Bear had observed, but the greater revelation had occurred within Elias himself, that even the deepest wounds could heal, that silence could give way to voice, and that a heart long frozen could remember how to beat with purpose and hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, testimony to be given, justice to be secured, lives to be rebuilt. But for this moment, standing with Clara, as darkness settled over the mountains, Elias allowed himself to imagine possibilities that had seemed forever lost in the blood-soaked fields of Antietam. His voice, once silenced by grief, had returned in defense of the innocent. Now it would speak of what lay ahead, not just survival, but life in its fullest measure. Denver in the spring of 1875 bore little resemblance to the rugged wilderness of the Colorado mountains. Brick buildings lined streets busy with commerce, carriages rattled over cobblestones, and the railroad depot hummed with the constant arrival and departure of trains connecting the frontier city to the civilized East. In a wood-paneled courtroom on the second floor of the federal building, Elias Boone sat ramrod straight in the witness chair, his newly trimmed beard and store-bought suit a concession to urban propriety. 3 months had passed since the destruction of Silverstone Mine, 3 months of depositions, evidence gathering, and preparation for what the newspapers were calling the trial of the century in Colorado territory. Captain Boone, said the federal prosecutor, a sharp-eyed man named Harrington, who had been sent directly from Washington, please describe for the court the events of February 12th when you first encountered Mrs. Hollander and her children. Elias's voice, now strong and clear after months of regular use, carried throughout the packed courtroom. I found them stranded in a blizzard after their wagon had overturned. The children were near freezing, and Mrs. Hollander was injured. I brought them to my cabin for shelter. And at what point did you become aware that they were fleeing from danger? Elias glanced briefly at Clara, who sat in the front row of the gallery, her 4 children beside her. She offered a small, encouraging smile. The youngest child, Annie, asked if I had come to hurt her mother like they had. Later, I observed bruising on Mrs. Hollander's wrists and a head wound that was inconsistent with a wagon accident. The testimony continued methodically as Elias recounted the pursuit by Maxwell's men, the revelation of John Hollander's evidence, and the final confrontation at Silverstone Mine. Throughout, he spoke with the precise clarity of a military officer and the careful observations of a trained physician. When shown the notebook recovered from Annie's doll, now a central piece of evidence, Elias confirmed its authenticity. These are the same documents Mrs. Hollander showed me during our journey. John Hollander documented the illegal mining operations on Ute land, the unsafe conditions that led to miners' deaths, and the bribes paid to territorial officials to conceal these activities. In the defendant's box, Territorial Governor Ashton shifted uncomfortably. Beside him sat Indian Agent Chambers and Judge Caldwell, all implicated in Maxwell's web of corruption. Maxwell himself was notably absent, his fate unknown after the mine's collapse. Some believed he had perished in the destruction, others suspected he had escaped and fled the territory. When the prosecution concluded its questioning, defense counsel William Barrett rose, a renowned attorney brought from Boston at considerable expense. His reputation for aggressive cross-examination preceded him. Captain Boone, Barrett began, his voice silky with practiced condescension, you testified that you hadn't spoken aloud for 7 years prior to these events. Is that correct? Yes. A condition arising from your experiences in the war, I understand. Barrett consulted his notes with theatrical precision. Specifically, the Battle of Antietam, September 17, 1862. Elias nodded. That's correct. Would you say such trauma might affect one's perceptions, Perhaps cause one to see conspiracies where simple business practices exist? The prosecutor rose immediately. Objection, Your Honor. Captain Boone's medical history is irrelevant to the facts of this case. I'm establishing the reliability of the witness, Your Honor, Barrett countered smoothly. Judge Wilson, a stern-faced federal judge brought in specifically for this trial, considered briefly. I'll allow limited questioning on this line, but tread carefully, counselor. Barrett turned back to Elias with barely concealed triumph. Captain Boone, isn't it true that after Antietam, you abandoned your medical practice in Philadelphia, withdrew from society, and lived as a virtual hermit in the wilderness? Elias met the attorney's gaze steadily. After losing my wife and son to fever in '67, yes, I chose solitude. And during these 7 years of self-imposed isolation, you maintained a complete silence, never speaking to another human being. Barrett raised an eyebrow. Some in the mountain communities refer to you as Elias the Mad, did they not? A murmur ran through the courtroom. Elias felt a momentary flash of the old shame, but pushed it aside. Some may have, I wouldn't know. Yet now you present yourself as a reliable witness in a case that could reshape the governance of this territory. Barrett gestured expansively. Based significantly on a notebook supposedly written by a man who can no longer testify to its authenticity. Elias leaned forward slightly. John Hollander's handwriting has been verified by multiple witnesses, including his former employers at the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. The survey maps he created have been confirmed by independent engineers. The mining claims documented in that notebook have been physically verified by federal marshals. His voice gained strength with each point. My silence was a choice, counselor, not a delusion. I saw what I saw. Barrett seemed momentarily taken aback by the calm force of Elias's response. He shifted tactics. You developed quite an attachment to the Hollander family during these events. Did you not, Captain? Elias felt the trap being laid but would not shy from the truth. I did. In fact, there are rumors that you and Mrs. Hollander have developed a relationship of a personal nature. The prosecutor was on his feet again. Objection. The witness's personal life is not relevant to this case. Goes to bias, Your Honor, Barrett insisted. Judge Wilson's gavel came down firmly. Sustained. Move on, counselor. Barrett's smile didn't reach his eyes. Very well. Captain Boone, you never actually witnessed Governor Ashton, Agent Chambers, or Judge Caldwell commit any illegal acts, did you? I witnessed the results of their corruption. The evidence in John Hollander's notebook. Yes or no, Captain, did you personally observe these men accepting bribes or ordering illegal activities? No. Thank you. Barrett returned to his seat with a satisfied air. No further questions. The prosecutor rose for redirect examination. Captain Boone, in your professional opinion as both a physician and a military officer accustomed to assessing evidence and making life or death decisions, do you have any doubt about the authenticity of John Hollander's documentation or the guilt of the defendants? Elias looked directly at Governor Ashton, whose face had grown increasingly pale throughout the testimony. None whatsoever. Thank you, Captain. No further questions. As Elias stepped down from the witness stand, he caught Clara's eye again. The pride in her gaze steadied him, reinforcing that regardless of the trial's outcome, they had already achieved a personal victory by reaching this day. The next witness called was Dr. Edmund Warren, whose testimony about his years working for Maxwell proved devastating to the defense. With clinical precision, he detailed the falsified death certificates, the covered-up mining accidents, and the regular payments made to territorial officials to maintain the conspiracy of silence. I was a coward, Warren admitted openly. I chose comfort and security over the truth, over the lives of men who died in unsafe conditions that I helped conceal. I will carry that shame for the rest of my days. And why have you chosen to testify now? The prosecutor asked. Warren's gaze found Elias in the gallery. Because I was reminded that redemption begins with truth, no matter how late it comes. The parade of witnesses continued throughout the day. Miners who had survived Silverstone, territorial officials who had rejected Maxwell's bribes and been forced from office, Ute leaders, including Walking Bear, who testified with dignified certainty about the encroachment on their lands. By late afternoon, Clara Hollander took the stand, dressed in a simple but elegant black dress, still in mourning for her husband. She presented a compelling figure of quiet strength. The courtroom fell silent as she recounted John's discovery of the illegal operations, his determination to expose the corruption, and the night he failed to return from the mine. He knew the risks, she said, her voice steady despite the evident emotion. But he believed that justice matters, that the truth must be spoken even when powerful men want it silenced. During cross-examination, Barrett attempted to suggest that John Hollander had been disgruntled after being denied a promotion, that his documentation was an act of revenge rather than justice. Clara's response was measured but firm. My husband was offered a significant bribe to overlook the safety violations and illegal claims. He refused. The promotion you mentioned was withdrawn after that refusal, not before. As the day's testimony concluded and the court adjourned until morning, Elias waited for Clara in the corridor outside. The children had been taken to their hotel by Thomas Jenkins, the kindly shopkeeper who had followed the case to Denver and appointed himself unofficial guardian of the Hollander children during the long days of testimony. You were magnificent, Elias told her when she emerged. Clara released a shaky breath. It was harder than I expected, speaking of John that way, with them staring at me. She glanced back toward the courtroom. Do you think it's making a difference? I do, Elias affirmed. Barrett's aggressive tactics suggest the defense is desperate, and Judge Wilson seems unmoved by their attempts to discredit the witnesses. They walked together down the broad marble stairs of the federal building and out into the late afternoon sunlight. Denver's streets were busy with the usual end-of-day commerce, the city largely indifferent to the drama unfolding in the courtroom, despite the occasional newspaper headline. The children will be waiting, Clara said, taking Elias's arm as they navigated the crowded sidewalk. Annie has been making drawings of the courtroom all week. She's quite convinced the judge looks like Moses from her Bible stories. Elias smiled at this, the simple domestic observation a welcome counterpoint to the gravity of the day's proceedings. Over the past 3 months, as they had prepared for the trial, a gentle routine had developed between them, a comfortable partnership built on mutual respect and growing affection. They had not rushed into declarations or commitments, both aware of the shadows that still lingered from their respective pasts. But in shared meals, quiet evenings with the children, and the gradual rebuilding of their lives, something solid had formed between them, a foundation upon which a future might be constructed once justice had been served. At the hotel, they found the children in the small meeting room of their suite, engaged in a game of checkers under Mr. Jenkins' watchful eye. Annie abandoned the game immediately upon their entrance, running to Elias with the unrestrained enthusiasm that had made her his particular favorite among Clara's children. Captain Boone, she still used the formal address despite his gentle corrections. Did you tell the judge about the bad men today? Did he believe you? Elias lifted her into his arms, an action that now felt natural where once it would have been unthinkable. I did my best to tell the truth, Miss Annie. The judge seemed to listen carefully. Thomas, who at 13 was becoming increasingly solemn and adult-like, looked up from the checkerboard. Mr. Jenkins says the newspapers are predicting convictions for all 3 defendants. Newspapers often get ahead of themselves, Elias cautioned, setting Annie down. We must let justice take its proper course. Samuel, now 10, moved his checker piece with deliberate concentration. But they're guilty, everyone knows it. Knowing and proving are different matters in a court of law, Claire explained, kissing each child in greeting. But we've done all we can to ensure the truth is heard. That evening, after the children were asleep and Mr. Jenkins had retired to his own room, Clara and Elias sat together on the small balcony overlooking the city. The lights of Denver spread before them, a constellation of human endeavor that seemed worlds away from the mountain wilderness they had both called home. What will you do when this is over? Clara asked, the question they had both been circling for months. Elias considered carefully before answering. Colonel Gardner has offered me a position as surgeon at Fort Collins, and the Ute Tribal Council has requested that I establish a proper medical practice near their reservation. Both worthy options, Clara observed. Where does your heart lead you? My heart, Elias repeated softly. He turned to face her directly. My heart leads me to wherever you and the children will be, Clara, if you'll have me. The directness of his declaration hung in the night air between them. They had been careful these past months, navigating the complex emotional terrain of grief and new beginnings. of children's needs in public perception. The children adore you, Clara said after a moment. Thomas respects you, Samuel wants to be like you, Maggie trusts you, and Annie, she smiled. Well, Annie decided months ago that you were meant to be part of our family. And their mother? Elias asked gently. Clara's hand found his in the darkness. Their mother has discovered that a heart once broken can heal, that love isn't a betrayal of what came before, but a testament to the human capacity for renewal. She met his gaze steadily. I love John. I always will. But I've found room in my heart for you, Elias. Room for a future I never expected to have. It was not a passionate declaration from romantic fiction, but something deeper and more enduring. An honest acknowledgement of complex emotions and a clear-eyed choice to move forward together. Elias brought her hand to his lips. When the trial concludes, whatever the verdict, I would like us to begin that future. Yes, Clara said simply. I would like that very much. The verdict came 3 days later, after closing arguments that stretched across an entire day and jury deliberations that lasted well into the night. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with spectators lining the walls and reporters from as far away as Chicago and New York scribbling frantically in their notebooks. Judge Wilson's voice carried clearly as he read the jury's decision. In the matter of the United States versus Ashton, Chambers, and Caldwell, on the charges of conspiracy, bribery, and obstruction of justice, this court finds the defendants guilty on all counts. A collective exhalation seemed to pass through the courtroom. Clara gripped Elias's hand tightly, tears streaming down her face. Behind them, Thomas sat absolutely still, his young face a study in contained emotion. The sentencing was appropriately severe, 15 years in federal prison for each defendant, all their assets seized, their positions of authority permanently revoked. As the gavel fell with finality, Clara leaned against Elias's shoulder. It's done, she whispered. John has his justice. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed around the key witnesses, clamoring for statements. Dr. Warren spoke briefly, emphasizing the importance of corporate responsibility in mining operations. Walking Bear declined to comment, his dignity requiring no verbal affirmation of the justice served. When they approached Elias and Clara, Elias stepped forward, his arm protectively around Clara's shoulders. Mrs. Hollander and her children have endured enough public scrutiny, he stated firmly. They deserve privacy as they rebuild their lives. What matters today is that the law has recognized the truth of John Hollander's documentation and held powerful men accountable for their actions. A persistent reporter from the Denver Tribune pushed forward. Captain Boone, rumors suggest that Ezra Maxwell may have survived the mine collapse and fled to Mexico. Do you believe justice has truly been served while he remains at large? It was a question Elias had considered deeply in the quiet hours of night. Maxwell, the architect of the corruption that had claimed John Hollander's life, deserved to face the same justice as his co-conspirators. Yet his absence from the trial had not prevented the truth from emerging. Justice is not measured solely by punishment, Elias replied carefully. The corrupt system Maxwell built has been dismantled. The illegal claims on Ute land have been invalidated. The truth of his crimes is now public record. He glanced at Clara before continuing. If he lives, he does so as a fugitive, stripped of power and influence. That is its own form of justice. They made their way through the crowd to where Mr. Jenkins waited with the younger children in a hired carriage. As they drove away from the courthouse, Annie crawled into Elias's lap, her small fingers tracing the buttons on his vest. Are the bad men going to prison forever and ever? She asked. For many years, Elias confirmed, long enough that when they come out, you'll be all grown up. This concept seemed to satisfy the child. She settled against his chest with a contented sigh. Now, can we go home? The simple question carried layers of meaning that did not escape either adult. Home, not the company house in Silverstone where the Hollanders had lived, nor Elias's solitary cabin in the mountains, but someplace new they would create together. Yes, Annie, Clara answered, meeting Elias's gaze over the child's head. Now we can go home. 2 weeks later, they stood together on a hillside overlooking a wide valley where the mountains gave way to rolling foothills. The land before them, 160 acres granted to Clara as part of the settlement against Maxwell's estate, stretched green and promising in the late spring sunshine. It's perfect, Clara declared, turning slowly to take in the vista. Close enough to the Ute reservation for your medical practice, yet within reasonable distance of the railroad for the children's schooling. Elias nodded in agreement, mentally placing the buildings they would construct. A proper house with rooms for each child, a medical office where he could treat patients, perhaps a small schoolhouse eventually, as other families settled in the area. Thomas had already begun pacing out dimensions for what he insisted should be the barn's location. His practical mind always focused on the workings of a homestead. Samuel and Maggie raced each other through the meadow grass, while Annie sat contentedly making a crown of wildflowers nearby. "Will you miss your cabin?" Clara asked, threading her arm through Elias's. "I brought what matters," he replied. The few personal possessions he valued, his medical books and instruments, his wife's locket with the lock of their son's hair, his army commission, were packed alongside the Hollanders' belongings in the wagons that had brought them here. "We should name this place," Clara suggested. "Every proper homestead needs a name." Elias considered for a moment, watching as Walking Bear approached from where the Ute contingent had made camp nearby. The old medicine man had insisted on performing a blessing ceremony for the new beginning, a merging of traditions that seemed appropriate for this frontier life. "Reconciliation," Elias suggested, "a place where past and future meet in harmony." Clara tested the word thoughtfully. "Reconciliation. Yes, I think that suits us." Walking Bear joined them on the hillside, his ancient face serene in the golden afternoon light. "You have chosen well, medicine man. This land has good spirits." "We hope to honor them," Elias replied, "and to establish a place of healing." The old man nodded approvingly. "The best healing comes from voices that speak truth. You have found yours again." He gazed out over the valley. "Now you will teach others to find theirs." The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks when they gathered for Walking Bear's blessing ceremony. The Hollander children watched with wide-eyed fascination as the old medicine man performed the rituals of his people, consecrating the land and those who would dwell upon it. When he had finished, Colonel Gardner, who had ridden out from Fort Collins for the occasion, stepped forward with a Bible in hand. "I believe you requested a Christian blessing as well," he said to Clara. "A proper foundation for your new beginning." What followed was a simple ceremony, not quite a wedding in formal terms, but a blessing of union nonetheless. Elias and Clara stood facing each other. The children gathered around them in a circle, as Colonel Gardner read passages about new beginnings and the building of homes founded on solid ground. When he closed the Bible, Gardner produced a document from his coat pocket. "I took the liberty of having the land grant officially recorded in both your names," he said, handing the paper to Elias. "Congratulations, Captain and Mrs. Boone." Clara looked up in surprise. "I didn't realize." "A precaution only," Elias assured her quickly, "to ensure the children's inheritance is secure regardless of what the future holds." But Clara's expression suggested she was not displeased by this development. She accepted the document with a small smile that held promise for conversations to come. As twilight descended, the first campfire of their new home blazed to life. Tomorrow would bring the hard work of building, felling trees, preparing foundations, establishing the practical infrastructure of a homestead. But tonight was for celebration and reflection. Dr. Warren, who had ridden out with Colonel Gardner, raised a toast as they gathered around the fire. "To new beginnings built on honest foundations. And to those who showed us the way," Elias added, thinking of John Hollander and his own long-departed family. The past would always be with them, acknowledged and honored rather than forgotten. Later, when the children had fallen asleep in the temporary shelter of canvas tents, Elias and Clara walked alone to the hilltop where they had first surveyed their new domain. The night was clear, stars scattered like silver dust across the vast Colorado sky. "Are you certain about this?" Clara asked softly. "Taking on 4 children and a widow? Building a life so different from your solitude?" Elias turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "7 years ago, I chose silence because I believed I had nothing left worth saying. You and your children reminded me that there is always something worth saying to those you love." He drew her gently closer. "I have found my voice again, Clara, and with it, the courage to build rather than merely survive." Clara's eyes shimmered in the starlight. Then say it, Elias. Say the words you've been holding back. He had been cautious these many months, respectful of her grieving and mindful of the children's adjustment. But here on the land that would be their home, with the past acknowledged and the future before them, the time for caution had passed. I love you, he said simply. You and Thomas and Samuel and Maggie and Annie. I love the family you are and the family we will become together. Clara's response was not in words, but in the closing of distance between them, her lips finding his in the darkness. It was a kiss of promise and commitment, of shared purpose and mutual choice. When they returned to the campfire, Walking Bear sat alone, tending the flames. The old man looked up at their approach, a knowing smile crinkling his ancient face. The mountain taught you silence, medicine man, he observed, and silence taught you wisdom. Now wisdom gives your voice its power. He gestured to the sleeping forms of the children in their tents. These young ones will grow strong in the shelter of that voice. Elias nodded, understanding the profound truth in the old man's words. His 7 years of silence had not been wasted. They had been a necessary interlude, a time of healing and preparation for this new chapter. As Walking Bear took his leave, returning to the Ute encampment nearby, Elias and Clara settled beside the fire. Tomorrow would bring labor and challenges, the practical reality of homesteading in this beautiful but demanding land. There would be difficulties ahead, the hard work of building, the integration of their separate pasts into a shared future, the raising of children marked by both loss and resilience. But tonight, watching the flames dance beneath the eternal stars, Elias felt a sense of rightness that transcended the uncertainties. He had journeyed from the blood-soaked fields of Antietam to the silence of the mountains to this moment of new beginning. The path had been long and often painful, but it had led here, to this woman, these children, this land, this purpose. What are you thinking? Clara asked, her head resting against his shoulder. Elias considered the question, feeling the weight and wonder of words after so many years without them. When he spoke, his voice carried the depth of all he had experienced, lost and found again. I'm thinking that some journeys require silence to find the words worth speaking. He gazed at the sleeping forms of the children, their children now, and that healing often comes in forms we never expected. Clara's hand found his in the firelight. No further words were needed as they sat together, watching over their newfound home and family as the stars wheeled overhead, witnesses to endings and beginnings, to silence broken and voices reclaimed. In the distance, a coyote called out to the night, a wild voice echoing across the valley that would soon be known as reconciliation, where a man who had chosen silence would build a legacy of healing words for generations to come.